Sejam bem-vindos. Eu vou pedir para todo mundo se acomodar para que a gente possa começar quase pontualmente. São 9h01 e eu prometi que eu subiria aqui às 9h, então a promessa está cumprida. Pode ir? Bom, vamos lá. 2025 precisa ser o ano da adaptação, e é por isso que a gente está aqui hoje. Meu nome é Nathalie Unterstel, eu sou presidente do Instituto Talanoa, e eu apresento esse evento aqui hoje com os parceiros Alana, Avina, A Vida no Cerrado, Argentina 1.5, Clima de Política, E3G, ERM Nint, GLEDES, Decodifica, Mission 2025, Groundswell, Global Optimism, Sistema B, Tony Blair Institute e Brazil Institute do Wilson Center. Eu quero fazer que nem filme antigo que o letreiro vem no começo e quero começar agradecendo de cara aos nossos apoiadores, em especial ao Climate Emergency Collaboration Group, Sarah, Diego, Chandrima, thank you very much indeed, ao Instituto Clima e Sociedade e ao UK Pact. Também quero agradecer ao time da Talanoa envolvido, porque sem vocês não estaríamos aqui hoje. Então, Roberta, Ana Luísa, George, Joel, Vergote, Renatinho, Liuca, Daniel, Suzana, Tassiana, Beatriz, Caio, Esther, Marta, Luciana, e também aos nossos conselheiros, muito obrigada, porque vocês provocaram a gente nessa direção. E não posso deixar de agradecer alguns indivíduos maravilhosos que, inclusive, durante as férias, durante o recesso, fizeram questão de nos ajudar. Então, Andréa Santos, Ana Múlio, Inamara Santos, Sérgio Margules, Kátia Fenives, Pilar Bueno e Matias Soderberg, que nos ajudaram a colocar esse evento de pé. Muito obrigada. E a presença de tantas pessoas aqui hoje, às 9h, eu tenho certeza que ao longo do dia a gente vai ter mais e mais gente, porque nesse evento, nesse momento, foi realmente impressionante. Eu acho que ele mostra como a adaptação climática, como prioridade, tem força. Ela tem apoio, é uma tese de muitas pessoas, e por isso é realmente uma alegria estar aqui hoje com vocês. Mas eu sei também que para algumas pessoas propor essa tese pode soar uma afronta.
I would also like to say that proposing this or putting forth this postulate to some of you may sound absurd, as if we were throwing the towel, meaning that mitigation is outdated. But I believe that postulate or perception is outdated because mitigation and adaptation go hand in hand. One cannot possibly move towards low emission levels without actually calibrating our actions by what we live with today. Furthermore, adaptation is ultimately limited by decarbonization. There can be no possible adaptation without removing fossil fuels and eliminating deforestation. As regards transition away from fossil fuels as determined and decided in Dubai in COP28, it is important that we put that in practice because delaying the transition also means failing in adapting. When we talk about adaptation as a priority for COP20, we are not yielding in to chaos. There's a thinker who has said that we should not really be prepared for chaos, but rather prepare ourselves for regenerating. So the proposal is about facing up to reality with a sense of courage and joy because we must protect what we love. And that is a reason for celebration. You might ask, joy, gladness happens? How can you be joyful in a warmer world, in a more unstable world where the impacts of global warming from 1.36 degrees Celsius, according to Copernicus, is found everywhere around us? And if even the ecological calendars of the indigenous peoples who have been adjusted for millennia to nature's cycles have been challenged, what can we say about our cities, our infrastructures, which have been designed and projected for a climate that is no longer there today? Adaptation has always been addressed by many as the B side of climate action, something to be done later, something minor and smaller, but it's here to stay. And there's nothing minor or small about the impact we are experiencing. We feel it in our skin, in our pocket, and on our table. Drought bringing cities to a halt, and power brownouts and blackouts, and the adaptation costs have been going up and up. Despite all of which, much of the world remains reluctant in transforming itself and invests in systems that have no resiliency, neither for the present nor for the future. Adaptation, I believe, builds in a somewhat disturbing reality that is politically difficult to digest because it is tantamount to the recognition that what we have done to date is no longer relevant. We should do things differently and better. Adaptation requires courage. It touches upon our identities, territories, assets, goods, inequalities. It even touches on our sense of human superiority, which we do have, by the way. Acknowledging all of that is not weakness nor madness, much on the contrary, it is an act of enlightenment. So we will declare that adaptation is not about giving up, it is about a strategy, and it's about planning for a future that is here to stay, and it is loaded and charged with historic reality. The time has come for us to consolidate a change in posture and in our mindset, and the time is now. And that is why I started out by voicing a thought-provoking sentence saying that 2025 must be the year of adaptation because there are many collective decisions that must be jointly taken on the matter at hand. In Brazil, we have 16 different sector adaptation plans that will soon be open to public consultation and comment as part of the UN Climate Convention. For the first time, we are in a position to set concrete indicators, the so-called Global Adaptation Goal, therefore materializing and making tangible that which is at times addressed as something abstract. Funding levels must double before the end of the year, and the roadmap to escalate from 100 billions to 1.3 trillion dollars in climate financing must and can include adaptation. All of these points will be addressed in today's panel sessions, and we we'll also discuss this unique opportunity for Brazil at the presidency of COP30 to consolidate these decisions and visions as part of an ambitious adaptation package in Belém, a package that will leave a legacy of resilience and transformation for the next decades. But let us be honest, there is an even greater challenge before us. COP30 cannot possibly kneel down to the tyrants and authoritarian powers in the world. It must be a point of light and perhaps a turning point amidst a geopolitics marked by conflict and setbacks. The Amazonian COP may show very clearly, in a very Amazonian way, that there are alternative pathways and new ways ahead. Perhaps, and that is why we propose that we use anti-racist lenses and look at children and young people with a sense of commitment to act now, today. We have also thought that this event today could be described as a festival, and that is why we have people from so many different parts of the world, different geographies, from Tanzania to the Maldives, from Ireland to Costa Rica and Norway and the Netherlands. We have adaptation champions, funding, financing champions, people who are engaged in adaptation. And that is why I would like to invite everyone to engage in an active listening exercise and engage in a somewhat ceremonial act of silence as we stop to hear so many people. Because at a point in time where so many people shout, maybe we should stop and try to listen to each other. Let us taste and enjoy every presentation and think about what we don't even agree on and which affects us deeply. Let us try to use the opportunity and the event today to act with clarity and joy. Oh, thank you so much. With that, I'd like to declare the event formally open, and I'd like to invite our special guest, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Marina Silva.
Bem, bom dia a todos, a todas. Primeiro eu quero agradecer a Deus por estarmos aqui. Quero cumprimentar a todos os...
Greetings, everyone, and I'd like to thank God for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank all of the organizers behind this powerful event, particularly Dr. Talani and the Talano Institute staff members, and someone I'm sure will provide tremendous contribution, Ambassador Patricia Espinosa from Mexico. Thank you so much. And it gives me great pleasure to have with us Sergio Margolis, Carlos Nobre, and several friends, both men and women, who have indeed provided tremendous contribution to the ongoing discussions regarding climate change and efforts related to it. I like the idea of holding this event in not such a ceremonial place so that we are able to, above all, listen to ourselves, listen to each other. And of course, talking about adaptation as a topic is absolutely key. And I really like this one song I learned with a former governor who has unfortunately passed away, Governor Eduardo Campos. Former Governor Campos liked to sing this song that was widely sung during carnival time, which would say as follows: whether the judges like it or not, our group is the champion group as part of the Carnival Parade Festival. I'd like to borrow the concept behind that sentence to say that whether they like it or not, the champions of and those who advocate climate denialism, the fact is that the point regarding the climate emergency is part and parcel of everyday reality in the world and in our country. And it is against that backdrop and in this context that we will engage in this discussion on adaptation and climate change. And obviously, as mentioned by Natalie earlier, this whole discussion is not at all segregated from the overall discussion on the mitigation agenda, because that is the actual root cause of the problem. It is not at all segregated from the discussion regarding means of implementation so that we are able to fairly address the issue. And above all, something I often like to add is that in addition to engaging in adaptation and mitigation efforts, we must transform. That is, let's say, the key pillar of what we wish to do, because only with difficulty will we be properly and duly adapted if we do not truly change the unsustainable development model that has ultimately led to everything that is happening around us today. Only with difficulty will we be able to effectively and efficiently mitigate if we do not actually change the development model. That means that even amidst everything that is going on out there among us and around us, we seem to be persisting and insisting on the same ways of producing and consuming that has brought us to where we are today. And there's something we can learn from science. And unlike just adaptation, The fact is that science has had to say disadapt itself, if you understand me. Science has had to engage in a creative disadaptation. Hello, Patricia, I hadn't seen you yet. Good to see you. But what do you mean? You might describe as a panacea to but also the scientific knowledge of the age-long knowledge of indigenous farmers and small farmers and their genetic improvement techniques in traditional populations who have learned and who have generated and established knowledge associated to natural resources. Science has stated, let us not deceive ourselves. It's 1.5 and nothing above that. And this has been a major step forward. And that is why in the UAE, we came out from the COP meeting with something that was totally unthinkable. And we must be brave enough to acknowledge in hindsight that in that specific context of the Dubai COP, where many of us thought that we would go nowhere, after 32 years discussing a series of different processes, procedures, architectures, and so on and so on and so on and so forth, as well as different rules, we ultimately came to an obvious conclusion. We must triple renewables. We must double the level of energy efficiency. We must face up to the very serious problem of damages that have already being caused, hence the agenda of loss and damage. We must also be aligned with Mission 1.5, fully so, and indeed engage in a transition towards phasing out the use of fossil fuels, consuming and producing and consuming countries leading the race, and developing, consuming, producing countries following suit. It was a very powerful gesture as a result of the overall stock-taking exercise conducted by the United Nations as regards the Paris Agreement, a major contribution given by the UN on that occasion. So when we think about adaptation, we must bear in mind all of these different contexts. Now, the point regarding adaptation, the fact is that whether you like it or not, adaptation is on the agenda to stay. It is not just a mathematical calculation or a statistical calculation regarding the temperature rise vis-a-vis the pre-industrial age. No, it is something that has materialized on a day-to-day basis in cities and in three different dimensions. Cities have experienced firsthand an increase in temperature or absolutely heavy rainfalls that actually disturb their investment patterns and their peace. And it also impacts the forest peoples who on a day-to-day basis see their lifestyles and livelihoods being undermined. It also impacts family farmers who have paid a high price in seeing their harvests totally destroyed. It also translates in the sheer lack of space, especially for our young people, given a lack of a future perspective and a lack of hope about the future. It is very sad to see children, adolescents, as a virtually endless, infinite time horizon ahead of them. But the fact is that today we see this very saddening phenomenon going on. And an even sadder phenomenon is going the granddaughter of a friend of mine who has been living in the US for quite some time. Her mother has been living in the US for quite some time. And they were actually engaged in this school homework. And I thought that the school's architecture and the choice of the homework was very, very ingenious. I'm not even going to mention this because I don't really know what the consequence may be for the child or for the family, or the child's family, or the family's child. I will not even say my friend's name because I don't want that child to be known. But anyway, the fact is that in that given state in the US, people cannot talk about gender issues. People are not able to talk about racial issues. They are unable to engage in any proselytistic effort regarding climate change. You are not supposed to co-opt anyone to have your own opinion. And people had this homework, or children had this homework about the Black legacy and the Black agenda. And I was honored to be chosen by that child, and she would tell my story as part of the homework. And we see clearly how children are actively engaged on the climate agenda, as well as engagement level from adolescents such as Greta, for example, when she started in Sweden, and also what we see in so many media, social media networks, young people engaged in a very active engagement or a very active agenda, much more than many of us. And this is a paradox because historically, humankind has always, of course, placed itself ahead of children to protect them. Whenever something happens, this is something very instinctive. We throw ourselves ahead of children to try to protect children from any accident. And we have come to a very absurd situation where children, young people, and adolescents, they're the ones who are now tossing themselves ahead of us to protect ourselves, therefore establishing this kind of ethical shame since adults are not doing their share or their part. As we used to say in northern Brazil, in my home state of Acre, when someone thinks of oneself as being thinks too highly of oneself, we often say, well, look at yourself in the mirror and see, wake up and smell the coffee. Really, we should allow our children and teenagers to really be children and adolescents, and allow our young people to think and dream about the future. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be looking at ourselves in the mirror, because much of our homework, if we had properly done our homework, we shouldn't be talking about adaptation today. We could rather be here to actually celebrate the fact that we have succeeded in doing our homework, because in 1976, physician Isbante Aranhos drafted an article stating that if we continued at that same pace of using up natural resources and transforming natural resources into greenhouse gas emissions, the planet would be warmed up. And that was stated back in 1896. And then we had, of course, the next century, and then the Brundtland Report and Rio 92 and everything that we have done. And here we are, 32 years later, to take the decisions that we already knew should have been taken regarding what should have been done. Does have an impact on three different dimensions in addition to people's lives. What happened, for example, in the Brazilian wetlands, in the Brazilian neotropical savannas, in the Amazonian region, in all of the Brazilian biomes, and the impact on people's health, not only as a result of the smoke and forest fires, but also in towns that are far away, such as, for example, cities that are far away, as is the case in Sao Paulo, for example. In the old normal, we used to have this underlying rationale of engaging in risk management and disaster management. The normal thing was that floods like the one that struck Rio Grande do Sul would not take place. But the fact is that in the old normal, we prepared ourselves by establishing rules, regulations, and processes to face up to disasters and properly manage disasters. But the fact is that now we must, in addition to managing disasters, which remains absolutely key, as is the case in Rio Grande do Sul, where about 6,000 public agents had to be mobilized to the front line, to the battle front line, to face up to everything that was going on, together with all of the ongoing efforts with the state apparatus and society and volunteers. In addition to all of that, we must now also work in parallel to properly manage risk. And risk management will require that new concepts be designed or established. That is no easy task. New approaches will be required. New and different regulatory frameworks are required. Different protocols are required. New and different processes and structures. A different vision regarding investments and infrastructure. Very quickly,
What would that investment vision be? We conduct financial investments, for instance, with the Bank of Amazonia or the Bank of Northeast, and this will naturally invest in our region as well. But today, what will really be a big investment is restoration and reforestation. That's a big investment. Why should we not think about a credit line with very low interests for that new paradigm? We have resources for our artificial infrastructure, both to make it and to maintain it or to restore it when in the old normal situation something happened. And what about our natural infrastructure? Who pays the price for a 14-meter river, as I saw in the state of Amazonas, with only 70.5 centimeters of water? That natural infrastructure needs to be protected, and there are a series of measures and investments that need to be made. This also has to do with adaptation. Adaptation isn't just us recovering, preparing vegetation, looking for nature-based solutions. Adapting is to adapt investments as well. What are the new credit lines? What are the new types of interests? What are the new ways of thinking about insurance or about decreeing emergency situations? Emergencies are declared after the fact happens. We need to do so before, ex ante, as Ercílio Gomes used to say. And what does this mean? It has a series of consequences, but here in Brazil, thanks to Senad, INPE, thanks to science and good sense, we know that we have 1,942 municipalities that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. And we cannot continue waiting for the problem to happen before we declare a state of emergency. And there is also something that's extremely terrible that happens all the time. In 2023, when we had a drought in the Northeast, this became apparent. At that point, we had to, through various means, give out food baskets, all types of help. And we knew already that in 2024 that the same thing was going to happen. That's why I insist that we need to create a new regulatory framework for climate emergencies. We need to create an integrated committee to provide support to climate emergency policies based on the science and the installed capacity that we already have, to be able to create a national council for climate security, a climate that can be created in all the states and municipalities, so that this responsibility is appropriately shared, so that the domain of mitigating, adapting, transforming, enabling the means is not looked at by the federal government alone, but that the states and municipalities are responsible for this as well. The responsibilities should be shared by everyone. This is an agenda that I believe will force us to also have new political narratives. The world has lost the capability of big narratives. Maybe the old liberty, fraternity, and equality is what we should think of. The one that led us to democracy, that made it possible for us. Ideas that move the world are very powerful. So this may be the biggest investment ever made. Those words, equality, fraternity, liberty, such important words. But as everything that is human, the time has come to do more, because this alone did not prove to be able to provide the answers that the world needs today. And what is the big narrative that we are facing today? I would not dare to say that any one of us alone would be able to condense anything at all in face of everything that is happening. But I do know from where it may come. It will come, and especially coming from the autochthonous peoples, from whom I learned to think out of the box, shall we say. not in a linear way. Socialists, developmentalists, capitalists, also developmentalists, progressists, developmentalists, we're all developmentalists. A linear view of development. I'm sorry, we have lost sound. We can no longer hear the minister. Others will be progressivists, sustainabilists, because of the other ones, part of them more conservative, part of them more progressive. What we cannot be at all is denialists. Denialists don't need to, they don't believe in adaptation and mitigation or transformation. They still want to deepen the chaos even more. What we're doing now, coming back to reality, sometimes when I give interviews, my friends, the journalists, so this was something very disruptive and balanced. Religious leaders, political leaders, traditional people, and many others will create a general evaluation to say whether what we're doing is aligned with point 5, so that we create an ethical embarrassment. Because it's not the COP of the Amazon, it's a COP in the Amazon. It's not the Brazil's COP, it's a COP in Brazil, but as I always like to say, it's not a moment to be optimist or pessimist. We need to be persistent. This is what will make the difference. What makes a difference is our ability to persist. Thank you very much.
Uau! Vamos respirar depois dessa fala brilhante da ministra Marina, incrível.
Let's take a deep breath after this brilliant speech by Minister Marina Silva. But in fact, we don't have time to lose. We will have to continue. Thank you very much, Marina. Thank you, team, for being with us here today. It's been incredible. Well, let's move forward. I have the honor to lead the first panel of the day, Patricia Campos Melo. She is a reporter of the journal Folha de São Paulo, the newspaper Folha de São Paulo. And as part of the panel with Patricia, we will have the fantastic Carlos Nobres, Sergio Margulis, and replacing Minister Aniele, Secretary Clarice dos Santos Jr. of the Ministry of Racial Equality.
Bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see a full house in the morning. I'm Patricia Campos Melo. I'm a journalist of Folha de São Paulo. It's an honor to moderate this panel and this incredible conference organized by Institute Talanoa to discuss adaptation here today and its implications and what aspects need to be considered. We will go further than whether we are advancing or not. We will talk about how this adaptation should be. And we have 3 excellent scientists that are with me here today. Although they did not want to be introduced, we have Secretary Cledson Geraldo dos Santos Jr., Secretary for Management of the National System for to Promote Racial Equality. He's an anthropologist and scientist at the Federal University of Virginia, Secretary of the Human Rights Council.
O economista Sérgio Margulis.
Economist Sérgio Margulis. Did I pronounce it correctly? Yes. He is a reference in the climate adaptation agenda and the author of a seminal study that is extremely important of the World Bank on climate adaptation. It was written 2 decades ago, but he's been working on a new study. Maybe later he can tell us a bit about this. He was Secretary of State of the Secretary of Strategic Issues of the Presidency of the Republic. And then we have climatologist Carlos Nobri, one of the most respected scientists in the world, a global reference in climate change in the Amazon. Thank you.
Bom, queria pedir para você começar, Carlos, explicando para a gente
I'd like
resumo
to ask you to start, Carlos, providing us with a very brief summary of the main challenges in the climate scenario. We know that there are many of them, but what should we be the most concerned about?
Good morning, one and all.
Olha, nem a ciência, alguns anos atrás, conseguiu prever.
Not even science, years ago, was able to forecast that we would come to 1.5 degrees now. I mean, late 2023 and throughout 2024, and even now in 2025. So it really did come as a surprise. I mean, science would say that we would be, or that we were 2.5 degrees above the usual in 2022, and in 2024, we assumed we would come to 1.3, but all of a sudden we came to 1.5. And we remained at 1.5, and then El Nino came to an end in April, May 2025, and the weather remained warm. And the warmest year in 125 years was 2024. And then El Nino came to an end, April, May, El Nino came to an end. And when we get to 2025, we have the La Nina. In other words, the Pacific Equatorial, the Pacific Ocean gets colder. And all of a sudden in January 2025, we get to 1.75 degrees. Never before, actually. I mean, you would have to go way back to the interglacial period to find that kind of temperature again. So thousands of scientists are trying to explain what happened, and there is a huge concern because what science is showing us, I mean, 2 articles published just last week on Nature and climate change. These articles are saying that we may never be able to go back. And it is a very serious situation because this maximum threshold has been achieved mainly as a result of a major reduction in low-level clouds all over the planet, especially above oceans. Low-level clouds reflect about 50 to 70% of sun or solar radiation. Without clouds, the ocean reflects 6%. COP30 now. Why is this right? I mean, adaptation must be a priority indeed, because we can no longer afford to rule out the possibility of not lowering the temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And all scientific articles have shown that we may even go down a little bit as far as the temperature level is concerned, but not significantly way down. The Paris Agreement in COP26 stated that we cannot possibly go above 2.5 degrees. You all remember the IPCC, the wonderful report issued in 2016, indicating that we could not possibly get to 20 degrees Celsius, and the number of environmental disasters at a global scale took place, such as, for example, the extinction of coral reefs, among other disasters at 2 degrees. All countries, 195 countries, signed the Paris Agreement, committing themselves not to go above 2.5 degrees and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and bringing down to net zero the overall balance of net emissions. But if we are unable to go back from where we are today, and if we still keep these goals, we will probably get to 2.5 degrees or more by 2050. This would be ecocide planet-wide. If we get to 2.5 degrees, we will ultimately trigger a number of no return points, no turning points. Let me just refer to 2 of them very quickly. The worst of which for us in Brazil would be Amazon. We would lose up to 50 to 70% of the Amazon region, and therefore lose the largest biodiversity in the planet, and inject 250 billion gases into the atmosphere and freeze Siberia, and billions of tons will be injected into the atmosphere. All coral reefs will be extinguished, and several species will be extinguished. The first man-made extinction of species by us, Homo sapiens. Minister Marina was brilliant in remarking that both things go in parallel, hand in hand, mitigation and adaptation. Absolutely. We must bring emissions down to net zero. President Lula in G20 in Rio said that we would be bringing global emissions down to zero by 2040. We have to do it way before 2050 because we would otherwise expose ourselves to the huge risk of extinction. And if that happens, by the way, we will not remain at 2.5. We, at the most, can get to 2 degrees. And as a result of that, all extreme events will increase substantially. Extreme events increase exponentially with temperature increase. If you look back in 2024, the atmosphere was or had 5% more water vapor or steam vapor as compared to 1990 or 2020. It seems little, right? Just 5%, but not really. We're talking about a huge amount of energy when you evaporate water from oceans, mainly from the oceans. What you're doing is you're injecting energy into the atmosphere, and that is what has led to all of the extreme events, which have become very frequent: intensive extreme rainfalls, droughts, and dry periods, which have sped up and accelerated rainfall or forest fires. So we must indeed adapt ourselves. It is time for adaptation. And as I said earlier, in the beginning, our species, Homo sapiens, 150 to 100 million years, we have evolved in this period, and the temperature has never really gone above this level. I mean, it was at this level about 120,000 years ago. Homo erectus, our forefathers before Homo sapiens, likewise, 2-3 million years on end. Never before has temperature gone above 1.5 degrees, as is the case today. So, if we are unable to uphold and keep temperature at the current level, and if greenhouse gas emissions remain high, as is the case today, and then we will trigger a number of different points of no return. I mentioned only two. There are 25 such tipping points, points of no return. And unfortunately, we have yet another tipping point from a political perspective, the so-called trumping point, if you understand me. It's something we couldn't ever imagine. I mean, a country that accounts for about 20% of global emissions, we could never think that we would be in for what's happening in the US today. But that means we must be actively engaged, because if we keep at the current level, we will probably get to 3-4 degrees at the turn of the century. 3 to 4 degrees means that the entire planet will become almost uninhabitable. All of Brazil will be totally uninhabitable, practically speaking, because our body will not lose heat. Young children, babies, elderly, and diseased persons will resist no more than half hour without being able to lose heat. Healthy adults and children will resist up to 2 hours, no more. So this is the huge challenge we have on the table today. And in conclusion, may I congratulate Minister Marin. I'm sure you all saw, very few of you are wearing white clothes today. I mean, wearing white clothes is all about adaptation. That's what Minister Marina is doing. Because a major cause of death are heat waves. We see people dying as a result of landslides and floods, etc. But it's a comparatively small number of persons. The World Health Organization says that heat waves account for about 1,500 deaths per year. It probably gets to more than 1 million every year. Heat waves are a major cause of death because we have never actually evolved at such high temperature levels. Minister Marina is wearing white clothes, and white clothes are very good clothes, for adaptation purposes compared to non-white clothes. And we have this huge challenge before us. Just to quote a figure regarding Brazil, only about 22 or 22% of Brazilian households have air conditioning systems, meaning that we have a huge challenge ahead in this regard. And also, as the minister very aptly indicated in her remarks, Brazil, we are one of the countries where large cities, not the case of Brasilia. Brasilia is the one city in Brazil which has a lot of green area. Microphone, please. The interpreters have no sound input from that mic.
São Paulo é uma cidade que a maior
São
parte de São
Paulo
Paulo
is a city where the vast portion of São Paulo has no vegetation whatsoever. Studies have indicated that the highly urbanized areas, especially the slums and have-not neighborhoods, in the summertime, the temperature is 10 degrees higher than the Atlantic forest right next door, a neighboring area, just to indicate the huge risk of heat waves. So we must also ensure that adaptation involves a transformation of our urban centers into green cities by means of the policies we're currently designing and engaged in. So these are the key challenges. And I totally agree. Let us bring all of the global adaptation challenges to the COP30 agenda, and they also apply to Brazil likewise. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carlos, for this very comprehensive and detailed overview. Unfortunately, a very frightening overview as well. Gladson, considering what Carlos Nobre indicated, I mean, there's so many tipping points. And also considering the so-called trumping point, as Carlos Nobre indicated in his remarks, and also bearing in mind that there is already an established reality in Brazil in the form of racial racism and the quilombola populations in the peripheries. Given the fact that they are marginalized, the former runaway slave communities and all that, how can we actually ensure that adaptation, climate adaptation, will not only attach privileges to the elite? Good morning, one and all, and thank you, the Tanaloa Institute, for the invitation. I'm here speaking on behalf of Mr. Anieli, and I'd like to voice her greetings. She was unable to come. And thank you, Patricia, for the question. Very relevant question indeed. I often say that for several types of disease, there is medication that can help us potentially find a solution. And I think democracy can be described as a value that must be exercised all the time. And the exercise in democracy must increasingly encompass players and include people and groups that have historically been marginalized so that we can indeed consolidate or solidify the very idea of democracy. The adaptation agenda and the terms of reference in this discussion, especially considering the privilege that we will have in welcoming COP30 in November, enables us to showcase to the world a set of reflections and practical actions by means of governments and companies and organized civil society to deliver to the world a COP conference that may potentially be the most anti-racist COP of all. It really says a lot about a country like ours, where the vast majority of the population is Afro-descendant or of African background. We also have a lot of indigenous peoples and former runaway slave communities, the so-called quilombola communities. So as regards the implementation of adaptation policies aimed at accommodating and overcoming the constraints that we see today, I'm talking particularly about the fact that the impacts of climate change are not equal on everyone. It is therefore key that those populations that are outside of the process and which may nevertheless be unaffected by adaptive processes, it is important to mainstream them into the monitoring processes. It is absolutely key that we be able to ensure that forums are available and that spaces for dialogue are available for these people to become more knowledgeable, especially those who live in the more vulnerable territories. They must be or must become and be made aware of the climate emergency. It is in the cities that real life takes place. So I think it is important for us to really make progress to the effect of ensuring that societal involvement be given a stronger and higher weight. Although we have made some progress, progress to date is still short of what is required. And the Brazilian state apparatus, of course, is responsible to ensure, or for ensuring that these people be empowered and that these instruments be able to voice the collective will by means of associative practices and reflection about their own reality. So those of us in the Ministry of Racial Equality and Minister Aniele Franco, we are fully convinced that the best way to fight environmental racism, also by fighting climate racism by a means of a robust and responsible adaptation policy, also involves ensuring participation forums for those who are the ones that are more and most interested in ensuring that adaptation takes place. Hello, hello. This mic is working. Thank you so much. What about you, Sergio? As we said earlier, you took part in this very important World Bank study about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, calculating the adaptation costs. And as Natalie indicated, today it is now increasingly clear what the costs of inaction are. The inaction costs are much higher than any adaptation costs. What are the hurdles? What are the barriers for more investments to be made and more dedication to be focused on adaptation? Well, thank you, Patricia, for the question. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you all organizers for the invitation to join you today. As regards adaptation, I'd like to put an end to the polarization and the discussion regarding mitigation and adaptation. It's not one thing or the other, it's one thing. They're both one point on the agenda. Of course, the point or the problem can only be solved by means of mitigation because the root cause of the problem is what we know, and whatever mitigation cannot possibly do, we must, of course, improvise and do what we can and try to live with 1.5 degrees Celsius. Bear in mind, adaptation is a little more complicated exercise than mitigation in that mitigation has two different features. Number one, it is in everyone's interest to benefit from mitigation. Everyone does mitigation. Everyone is interested in mitigation. No one can avoid that. Whereas adaptation is a more local decision. For example, a given street that will be flooded, and you know it will be flooded every 2 years. You may have an individual who may be willing to build a wall around his house to avoid the flood. And you may, by contrast, have a neighbor who will say, hey, I'm not doing anything. I'm going to get the money and I'm going to educate my children. I'm going to have my children study at a better school. And every 2 years, I'm going to do my best to control the floods or the inundation around me. So each individual at a local level will, of course, try to adapt as best possible, as best he or she can. And the main challenge regarding adaptation, given the myriad of problems as mentioned by Professor Nobere, the point is that what do you do? I mean, how do you go about adaptation? Where do you start adapting? The vast majority of cities, well, not exactly, but let me rephrase that and say that very few cities in Brazil have some kind of adaptation plan. I'm not even saying adaptation plan, but some kind of risk analysis of what may lie ahead. After all, what are you going to be adapting to? What exactly are you adapting to? I'm from Rio de Janeiro. What kind of problems do we have in Rio de Janeiro? Well, the mountain slopes that are highly threatened, the heat waves, the sea level rise, as well as the torrential rainfall that are about to come. Where do we start? Let's say I'll give you a $100 billion check. What do you do? Where do you start adapting? What about the federal government? Where do we start adapting? Well, there are certain things we already know what and how to do. Let's plant more trees in the cities. Let us lower the temperature levels in cities. Let us set up water fountains, public water fountains. There are things that are a little easier. What about sea level rise? When is it time for us to expand the shorelines? When is it time for ports to be adapted? How much does all of that cost? So risk analysis is the kind of exercise that involves a lot of learning ahead, not to mention all of the uncertainty mentioned by Professor Nobres. He didn't tell us what will happen. He pictured this very frightening scenario, and we're really appalled about what may happen ahead, but still we don't really know the day, the time. in the place of the next disaster. Adaptation is an ongoing exercise. We have been adapting ourselves to the climate forever. It's not a novelty. It's not like we're starting to adapt ourselves to climate change today. No, we humans have always been adapting ourselves to climate forever. For example, when you provide maintenance to the water draining or water drainage system in a city, you're adapting yourselves. You're trying to avoid a flooding or a flood. It may have nothing to do with climate change, but it's all about maintenance and adaptation to the Porto Alegre tragedy in Brazil's southernmost state. We had, of course, compounded tragedies and very regrettable events, but one of these events was the fact that the floodgate got locked. The floodgate got locked, and the pump that would inject water outside of the floodgate were deprived of electrical power outage. I mean, that was not the only reason, but then again, proper maintenance and proper operating of urban infrastructure is absolutely the key and central to adaptation. So it's a complicated task. It is a part of the development process. Yes, it is. But then again, you cannot turn a blind eye to it. You cannot ignore it. The first thing you must do is, of course, access information at the local level and carry out the risk analyses and understand what lies ahead at the local level and establish the relevant decision-making criteria as to what is worth doing.
Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you, Sergio.
It's very interesting to see what you have to say. There is a need to plan for these needs, but I'd like to hear from you. How can we incorporate social justice into this planning when you're identifying and planning things in order to not to just work reactively? How can we add to this technical aspect another one that has to do with reducing inequalities? We spoke a bit about that, the participation of populations, for instance.
Bom, primeiro é fundamental aqui.
Well, first, it's essential, unequivocally, to ensure that we defend the production of evidence as a sine qua non element to be able to ensure adaptive dynamics that are in accordance to reality. The employment of science is a fundamental element so that we can visualize the success of this task. And this process needs to be together with an understanding, and here I call you back to this place of reflection, understanding that here in Brazil, we have also been able to identify this in other countries, especially in Latin America, the fact that we have a history marked by inequality that finds its genesis, obviously, in the dynamics of colonization and slavery. We have inherited this inequality that made us be men and women that have unequal conditions, and that makes a difference for us to find solutions for the people. It becomes more and more difficult. I'd like to call attention to a discussion of up to what point we are developing here in terms of a proposal or a project with the purpose of addressing adaptation process that dialogue the most with realities outside our continent than inside it. Up to what point are the realities that are reflected and then that can be investigated in this side of the world are part of this role of epistemologies that make it possible to produce an adaptive process that really reflects our societies and the challenge of our communities, and that are able to solve the historical need to bring together climate change, fair transition, and historical reparation in order to ensure climate and racial justice. This is an element that I consider to be quite urgent It is an emergency just as the crisis is an emergency. We need to answer at an equal rate. And for me, it is also clear that we are facing a situation that as we strive to find answers to mitigate the climate crisis and to produce adaptations that make it possible for us to be resilient in face of our daily processes. And here I always like to make a parenthesis in terms of what we can learn about coexistence processes in the semi-arid, where people who live in that area and in those territories in the semi-arid areas of Brazil have learned how adaptation can lead us to a process of coexistence so that we don't need to start from scratch in terms of seeing what's going to happen. We need to think of the fact that much of the answers can be found in the territorial experiences of traditional and local communities who do not or are not part of the urban agenda, as is the case of indigenous communities that do not live in villages and that live in some of the big cities of our countries. And thinking of a more objective reflection of the urban scenario, we need to think about what contributions the Brazilian periphery can give to the adaptation process. How much would public management that is democratically committed and responsible for meeting the needs of the population, how much would it advance if it was able to join with the experience of the communities that do not have access to the civilization goods that are often available in the cities? I think we should advance in this discussion. The entire debate would win with this because we would be looking at building a set of adaptation plans in the cities, but not restricted to state secretariats, for instance. And this needs to be taken to those places where the climate impacts are felt the strongest by the population. That is what I truly believe in. We need to make sure that the mitigation adaptation process becomes more democratic. Thank you, Secretary. Professor. Natalia said in her introductory words, and Sergio also mentioned, that mitigation and adaptations complement each other. They're not competing concepts. However, there are limitations to adaptation. If we do not decarbonize quickly, it will not be enough. We will not be able to survive just through adaptation. So how can we make sure that adaptation is not just palliative care? Yes, well, that is something that, as Marina and Sergio said, both aspects are totally connected. Let me give an example of the ecological, geological, climate adaptation of the planet. Photosynthesis, let's call it mitigation, but photosynthesis removed carbon gas of the atmosphere millions of years ago. If this had not happened, there would be no life in this planet. So mitigation, photosynthesis, but also plants evolved with an enormous adaptation. Plants are those that recycle the most water. So to maintain a perfect temperature for photosynthesis and maintaining a climate that allowed the planet to evolve. I'm speaking here about millions and millions of species and their evolution, so both things are totally connected. The ecological, geological, and climate systems of the planet are essential, and this goes for us humans as well. Things are totally connected.
Quando a gente fala adaptação, não vamos pensar
when we speak about adaptation, we should not think of humans alone. Adaptation has to protect the entire life of the planet. Let me give an example. I was the first scientist 35 years ago that published the article showing that the Amazon might pass the tipping point. But at that time, I was looking only at deforestation, which was 70% at the time. And I said, if deforestation grows too much, we will miss our opportunity and lose almost all of the Amazon. We will reach a tipping point. As you all know, the Amazon absorbs a lot of carbon. All the forests of the world withdraw 1/3 of the CO2 that we throw in the air. The oceans, another 22%. But if we cross the tipping point, the Amazon will self-degrade. It will become an open system, totally degraded. So in order for us to not just stay alive and ensure that all the species on the planet stay alive, we will need restoration. We need to accelerate restoration of the biomes, the Brazilian biomes, all biomes. We have the greatest biodiversity worldwide. 15 to 18% of all the species, known species of plants and animals are there. Many people think that forest restoration is just to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Yes, that's extremely important. But as important as this is adaptation, restoring the biomes, we will protect biodiversity. We will create the climate in which biodiversity has always evolved, and we will save and adapt biodiversity and ourselves as well, as we mentioned before. The big restoration, green cities, urban sponges, green urban sponges. They will not just absorb CO2, but the main thing is that they will create a microclimate in all the cities that will be much better for us, for humans. So these things have always evolved in billions of years. When this is the first time that photosynthesis came up as 3 billions of years ago with cyanobacteria. This is just to mention that both things always have been connected and have always evolved together, and even more so now. Thank you, Professor. Sergio, you mentioned that you're involved in a research network and that you're doing a new study on adaptation. If you could speak a bit about that and about what you discovered. What can we do to catch up in terms of adaptation? How can we recover some of the time we've lost? Well, Patricia, if you allow me, before that point, I'd like to refer to a point he mentioned. It's even possible that we have a lot of uncertainties about the need to adapt. One thing that we also know is we know exactly who the vulnerable populations are: the poor, Black, women that are not supported. That's a map of who will have problems, who will die the next flood, in the next heat wave. And so you may say, well, let's do policies for that. Well, we have a very bad track record on that. The country has never done well there. It's never been ashamed of keeping this inequality. It's probably going to continue doing this as it always has. And well, now adaptation will we really go on to prioritize the poor, the Black, and women? I doubt it seriously, even though we are very aware of the fact that that's where the problems lie. So let us wish ourselves good luck if we want to face this challenge, because this is really where the problems will be. There's no doubt about it, none at all. If we do a risk analysis, we don't need to do a very detailed one. There is no doubt that that's where we will find the problems, in poor, vulnerable areas without infrastructure and so forth. So that really is a tremendous challenge. Now, about what we're doing, although that is a central part of our work, at a moment when the climate study is being done, what we propose is addressing infrastructure. Tucuruí, for instance. Well, it would be best if it doesn't stop working. It provides almost 50% of the energy that the country needs. What happens if Tucuruí stops working? It will be chaos. And what's the risk of Tucuruí? What's the risk of the Port of Santos? What risks exist for the Presidente Dutra Highway or transmission lines coming from the Amazon? What should we do? When? What precisely? So it's a top-down study to examine large infrastructures, large threats that will require a lot of attention. Parenthesis here, the federal government, not just in the Ministry of Environment through the climate plan, but also through the GSI, the Institutional Security Cabinet of the Presidency of the Republic. These are the guys who surround the president saying, President, the country is working. The general delivers a letter every day saying, Mr. President, everything's fine, no terrorism, no floods, and so forth. So these guys have been doing studies to know what's happening with critical infrastructure, but they don't have critical studies on adaptation. So that's what we are examining right now. It will be a small contribution on a very important subject. It's true we're not looking at vulnerable populations, but we're looking at a macroeconomic framework saying, well, these infrastructures cannot stop. We can't wait for the problems to happen in Tucuruí or in the Port of Santos or in huge cities, for instance. So the idea is to have a macro view of big infrastructures. Thank you. We have so much more to say, really, but unfortunately, our time for this panel has run up. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for your excellent classes.
Gente, a gente vai fazer uma pausa agora.
We're going to have a pause now. We'll have a 10-minute break, 10 to 15, let's say. And I'd like to recall that the next panel will require you to make sure that you have your interpretation equipment, because the panel will be in various languages, 3 languages actually, Portuguese, English, and Spanish. So do please make sure that you have your headsets with you.
As a waitress in a cocktail bar, when I met you, I picked you out, I shook you up and turned you around, turned you into someone new. Now 5 years later on, you've got the world at your feet. Success has been so easy for you. But don't forget it's me who put you where you are now, and I can put you back down too. Don't you want me? You know I can't believe it when I hear that you won't see me. Don't you want me? You know I don't believe you when you say that you don't need me. It's much too late to find. You think you've changed your mind? You'd better change it back, or we will both be sorry. Don't you want me, baby? Don't you want me? Oh, don't you want me, baby? Don't you want me? Oh, I was working as a waitress in a cocktail bar. That much is true, but even then I knew I'd find a much better place, either with or without you. The 5 years we have had have been such good times. I still love you, but now I think it's time that I live my life on my own. I guess it's just what I must do. Don't you want me? You know I can't believe it when I hear that you won't see me. Don't you want me? You know I don't believe you when you say that you don't need me. It's not too late to find. You think you've changed your mind? You'd better change it back, or we would both be sorry. Don't you want me, baby? Don't you want me? Oh, don't you want me, baby? Don't you want me? Oh. Step off the train, I'm walking down your street again, past your door, but you don't live there anymore. You've been there, now you disappeared somewhere, like out of space. You found some better place, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain. Could you be that? You always were 2 steps ahead of everyone. We'd walk behind while you run. I look up at your house, and I can almost hear you shout down to me, where I always used to be. And I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain, and I miss you. Like the deserts miss the rain. Back on the train, I ask myself, Sometimes I feel I've got you. Run away, I've got you. Get away from the pain you drive into the heart of me. The love we share seems to go nowhere, and I've lost my light. For a dust and turn, I can't sleep at night. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love, tainted love. Now I know I've got you. Run away, I've got you. Get away. You don't really want any more from me. To make things right, you need someone to hold you tight. And you think love is to pray, but I'm sorry, I don't pray that way. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love, tainted love. Don't touch me, please, I cannot stand the way you tease. I love you, though you hurt me so. Now I'm going to pack my things and go. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears, and that's not nearly all. Tainted love.
I love myself. I want you to love me when I feel down. I want you above me. I search myself. I want you to find me. I forget myself. I want you to remind me. I don't want anybody else. When I think about you, I touch myself. Oh, I don't want anybody else. Oh no, oh no, oh no. You're the one who makes me come running. You're the sun who makes me shine. When you're around, I'm always laughing. I wanna make you mine. I close my eyes and see you before me. Think I would die if you were to ignore me. I fool could see just how much I adore you. I get down on my knees, I want you to remind me. I don't want anybody else. When I think about you, I touch myself. Oh, I don't want anybody else. Oh no, oh no, oh no. I touch myself.
So true, funny it seems, always in time, but never in line for dreams. Head over heel, won't do the toe. This is the sound of my soul. This is the sound. I bought a ticket to the world, but now I've come back again. Why do I find it hard to write and explain? I know this match is true. I know this match is true. With the thrill of my hand and the peel of my tongue, deaths of the nerves that have just begun. Listen to Marvin all night long. This is the sound of my soul. This is the sound. Always living from it. Set a time of its own. Take your scissored arms and write an explain. Oh, I want the truth to be known. I know this much is true. I know this much is true.
All right,
comida também deve estar
folks,
boa.
I know that the conversation is great. The food probably is as well, but let's start. Right, following with our plans, we have a panel and we will be projecting the participants. We have a very daring, very bold panel, I should say, because its focus is adaptation as an answer to the real world. How can we actually be transformative? I have the honor and the pleasure to invite Lorenzo Gustani, counselor of the AB system and also Foundation Mandala, to be the moderator, facilitator of this conversation. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. We are ready to start. Please introduce our dear speakers. I'm going to ask you please to from Costa Rica. And last but not least, our co-chair of the Indigenous Caucus, which is an extremely important area of coordination of the convention, and she's also a very important leader, Cinea do Vale. Thank you.
Obrigado, Nathalie. Só lembrando que a gente vai...
Thank you. I'd like to recall that we are going to be switching between English and Portuguese. So if you need translation, do remember to get your equipment. I'd like to start by giving you some words of thanks, first of all, to everyone who made sure that this event could happen, including the production teams, the audiovisual team, hospitality, cleanliness, installations, everything. To the caretakers of this facility, the people who were in charge of making this happen, particularly Ms. Figueira, who is here to work as the ombudsman and who is keeping an eye of what we're going to say. I'd like to thank Natalie and the entire team of the Talanoa Institute and the supporters for having the courage and the consistency of making sure that this very important item is actually on the agenda. I am tired. I think that many people who are here are also tired of receiving reports that speak about the worsening of the climate crisis and insisting adaptation while nothing is done. And I always ask myself, if not now, then when? Since we are here today in very great numbers to contribute to the construction of this agenda, this existential agenda, I am pleased to see her. And so I'd like to thank my friends who are here with me upstage today, and I will start by presenting them right away. Irene Suarez Perez was the chief negotiator of ILAC, a coalition of countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, in the Framework Convention of the UN on Climate Change. She represented Costa Rica in the Paris Agreement. She acts in the Climate Champions, and today she is a counselor of Global Optimism, focused on the implementation and transformation agenda of nature systems and food.
Cinea do Vale.
And we have Cinea do Vale. Welcome. She is an indigenous leader of the ethnicity Macuxana of the indigenous lands Raposa, Terra do Sol, and Serra da Lua in the state of Roraima, environmental manager and coordinator of the Environmental Department of the Indigenous Council of Roraima. Cinea also has strong activities in the negotiations for the COP. Ambassador Vanessa Dolce de Faria, working in the cabinet of Minister Mauro Vieira, High Representative for Gender Issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, and Orville Gray from Jamaica. He is currently the Executive Secretary of Global Network of the National Adaptation Plans. He has 20 years of experience in environmental policies. He was part of the Green Climate Fund, negotiator of BIOSIS, a coalition of approximately 40 in island countries, low-lying island countries who are particularly vulnerable to climate change. Welcome, everyone. Now, to heat up our debate and offer a background for the conversation that we will have today, I would like to situate the adaptation agenda in 4 issues. First, a pragmatic aspect. Mitigation by itself will not be enough for us to turn around this very challenging context that we find ourselves in. As we heard in the prior panel, adaptation and mitigation are 2 sides of the same coin. Mitigation reduces the causes, and adaptation reduces the impact of what we were unable to or did not want to solve. And this may be the reason why it's more difficult to speak about adaptation than mitigation, because adaptation presupposes that the planet having problems is something that is already a fact. And it is not enough to just work little by little in increments that might make it seem that you will be able to solve problems by applying the same mentality that created them. The second thing is the economic side, because it's worth investing in adaptation. This may be the investment thesis that is the most convincing one of our times. 1 billion invested in preventing floods in coastal areas, for instance, generates 14 billion of economy in terms of losses and damages. And if 16 billion were invested every year in regenerative agriculture, low carbon agriculture, family agriculture, almost 80 million people would no longer be hungry in the next 25 years. So in the world of adaptation, the accounts close. There's a very high return on investment. The third imperative is in the area of evolution, taking advantage of what the professor said a while ago. Evolution is intrinsic to human nature. We are wired to adapt to the space and times in which we live. And if the conditions of Earth change due to man-made actions, man will need to adapt and establish a synthropic relationship with nature, the nature of which it depends to survive, and therefore the nature to which it belongs. So the adaptation agenda is an invitation to our own evolution as a species. And the fourth imperative that I would like to provide here is the ethical one, because life wants to persist, and the adaptation agenda proposes the appropriate conditions for life to flourish. If not by us, then by those who will come after us, and those who will have to pay the price for our negligence, as Minister Marina said, those who are fearing for their future. So we need to leave the world a bit better, a bit less worse. This is, yes, a moral and ethical obligation. Adaptation shows us how to do so. Well, let's stop with the philosophy and let's go to concrete facts. I'm going to take the freedom of transitioning to English now to be able to honor our guests.
As we spoke about this weekend, this is a watershed COP, not only because it comes on the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, but also because it could very much
set the tone for what we can collectively do over the next 10 years. Can you tell us how you would frame the progress from the past 10 years and what we can realistically hope for over the next decade, particularly in terms of financial flows towards adaptation?
Excellent. Obrigada, Lorenzo, and gracias, Instituto Talanoa, and all the supporters for setting up this event with focus on adaptation so early on in this critical year. I won't delve into the urgency of adaptation. The Minister Silva and the last panel elaborated on that in a masterful manner. But I will focus in on the opportunity of adaptation and this watershed, as you just said, Lorenzo. So Paris was in itself a watershed where I think it's important that we recognize where we're coming from. And before the Paris Agreement, adaptation was considered a local issue only. So it was a matter that each of our countries had to deal with. And yes, as Sergio Margulis was saying, local adaptation is important, but adaptation is a global issue. We need to consider how interconnected this planet is and how there's a system approach to adaptation that global approach will facilitate action on. We need radical collaboration, and having a global adaptation regime, which is what was established in the Paris Agreement, facilitates that. And that's why we have a global goal on adaptation, which is a shared vision across countries. And with this global adaptation regime, for the first time ever, now parties are communicating through their climate change plans what their priorities and needs of adaptation are. And now with this clarity of this locally owned priorities and needs, we can now at a global level, and this is critically important for the finance, Lorenzo, we can begin to identify opportunities of investment, where there are trends that are required, technologies that are needed to help us reduce vulnerability in different sectors, infrastructure, cities, and so much more. So now the Paris Agreement has enabled that. And we have now cycles of NDCs, of national adaptation plans, and we'll be hearing about that from Orville. And now we need to know that climate plans are precisely an opportunity for countries to exert this roadmap of economic transformation, of how job creation will come to be, of opportunities of investment, and also of protecting people and nature. So that's the Paris plus 10. That's where we are. That's how we've come to where we are. So Belém plus 10. So many of us believe that Belém can provide enabling conditions and an upward spiral of unlocking transformational adaptation action. That's what 196 countries coming to Belém can begin to really move forward in this critical decade. And I'm just going to elaborate on 5 elements for the Belém plus 10. The first element is how we can seize the radical collaboration required across government efforts and non-state actor efforts. This is the action agenda. Governments need support, and we need a whole economy approach to adaptation. And in that sense, we need this radical collaboration in this action agenda to be grounded in local ownership. This needs to be led by gender approaches. It needs to integrate indigenous peoples' local knowledge as well. And of course, this action agenda will build off of what we currently have. And that is being led by the high-level champions, and there are many efforts like the food declaration that was just recently adopted, the food system call to action, the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, nature positive for climate action. So there are many efforts that are already supporting cities, business, financial institutions to accelerate climate action and support governments. Let me unpack the second element, which is the finance angle of that action agenda. And the truth is that business and financial institutions are understanding that adaptation is an imperative. They understand this because they see the risks, the impacts. They live these risks. And they also have a fiduciary duty to deal with the risk. But they also see the opportunity and the fact that the adaptation market will be of $2 trillion by 2030. We need to seize that opportunity. And now data is ever so more available, and that provides confidence for business and financial institutions to step up. The third element I want to unpack is elements of the global financial reform. And these are important because they unlock much more capital. How we deal, for example, with sovereign debt instrument, and how we tap into the opportunity of action and the cost of inaction. For example, for every $1 invested in nature-based solutions, that unlocks $4 to $15 of costs that could be saved and increase of productivity. Likewise, just on mangroves and blue carbon, we're seeing that there's a $15 billion opportunity that will help reduce impacts in coastal marine zones. So those are also linked to the finance. Let me go into the last 2 points of elements of this Belém plus 10. And that is the synergies between adaptation, nature, and food system transformation. And in COP30, it would be ideal that parties adopt enabling conditions like a work program that would facilitate the synergies across these 3 agendas. Why? Governments right now are preparing biodiversity strategies while they're preparing their climate plans. And the truth is that there's a huge opportunity for governments to enhance their climate ambition if they integrate biodiversity conservation, restoration, and food system transformation. Similarly, non-state actors are progressing on their net zero climate goals, but also on how they're reducing their own vulnerability. And similarly, they too can seize and accelerate action by integrating biodiversity protection, seizing the opportunities of investment, and addressing their risk. So the synergies across these 3 agendas is essential. And lastly, I'll talk about the data. The data, the monitoring and evaluation systems, Orville will also speak about this much more, disclosure and transparency. There's been so much progress on this. TCFD and the Task Force on Nature framework and disclosure as well. We need to seize in Belém and moving forward the disruptive opportunities that technology, artificial intelligence, and tools provide. Tools that we have right now available to us that are for land use, for biodiversity. And those tools can help us address adaptation. Instruments like Mapiomas, like Encore, like Trace, like Forest IQ. Geospatial platform tools that help us understand opportunities and also risk, like Restore, restore.eco. This will allow us to seize opportunities of restoration. And we need to also use these tools to allow direct access of finance to farmers, indigenous peoples, and local communities that are in that last mile of the supply chains, that are already pivoting from extractive agriculture to regenerative agriculture, that are already addressing land conversion, as Minister Marina was just saying. We need to support them, and technology can help us do that in a much more direct manner. So these are just 5 elements. There could be many more. We'd love to discuss this with you, and we remain hopeful that we can do this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Orville, Irene just spoke of the untapped potential for the adaptation agenda. And while we're certainly not where we need to be, there are several countries that are already making important strides on adaptation. Which are these countries? What are they doing that we must learn from? And how are they building consensus and getting adequate financing?
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you to Natalie and team for the invitation. We're very happy to be here. Let me step out a bit on your question, and I'll touch on a few facts. 87% of countries have an adaptation planning instrument in place. This is articulated in the Adaptation Gap Report of 2024. 51% have done a second instrument, and 20% have done a third instrument. This means that countries are progressing where their national adaptation plans are considered. So they're not behind the bar. They're ahead of the bar in some respects. When you look at what has been submitted to the NAP Central for UNFCCC, the numbers look small. Only around 60 NAPs have been submitted. But this does not take into consideration the different processes that are taking place in countries. So there are countries that may not have a NAP, but they have an adaptation plan in another form. And they are acting on this. They're discussing with their partners about how to implement their adaptation priorities that have been identified. So there's a lot that's taking place, and I think, as you've said before, we need to recognize that adaptation is happening and countries are taking it serious. And as much as it may not be as sexy as mitigation, there is a lot that's happening there. In Jamaica, we have a phrase referring to adaptation. We call it coping. When you go around and ask people what they're doing, how they are managing, they say they're coping. When you start to talk about climate change adaptation, they say this is not new. We've been coping for a long time. We've been dealing with floods. We've been dealing with heat. We've been dealing with a lot of different challenges that come with the climate impacts that we have. When you look, for instance, in this side of the world, I don't think there is any country on this side of the planet that does not have or already engaged in a national adaptation planning process. Haiti is the only LDC on this side of the world, and Haiti has an app. All right. There are over, 143 countries of 154 developing countries have already initiated or launched an app. So it would be more appropriate to try to identify the 1 or 2 countries where things are not happening. There are countries that are experiencing significant conflict, whether it be socio-political or otherwise. There are countries, there are wars taking place. But even with this, they are still putting in place measures to adapt to climate change. The challenge that we have is how to ensure that it is well integrated into decision-making processes. How to ensure that the government is taking advantage of the data that's available and discussing with persons at the local level. I was listening to the panel earlier, and there are a couple of things that came out to me. Adaptation, as you know, is highly contextualized. It's country-driven, but it's also very local. There may be a flood down the road, but the people up the road are fine. We have to recognize that there are a lot of these little nuances, even in countries. And the challenge to adapt to those is a big one. But it means that we need to be talking with each other a lot more. There's no way that our politicians are going to solve the problem. And even at the global level, we had the Paris Agreement, we're 10 years on. There's been a lot of progress, but the political ownership of adaptation needs to remain high. Because if you listen to the numbers on the panel before, as time goes by, as the target on emission reduction, we miss those. As we move from 1.5 to potentially 2 to maybe more, the cost for adaptation goes up. It doesn't go up incrementally. It goes up exponentially. This is something that we need to recognize, know, and figure out how we're going to challenge and deal with that. In terms of investments, there's a lot that's happening. Countries are putting both domestic and international financing into implementing their adaptation priorities. I believe Brazil's NAP came out in 2016. And they've been doing a lot of work on that, and they're looking to see how they can filter that down into sub-national adaptation plans. I'm sure there's a lot more work there to be done. But that's a challenge that we have. I was looking at a number of examples, because when it comes to adaptation, you really have to speak to actions that have been taken on the ground. Otherwise, everyone ignores you. There's a good case, I won't call the name of the company, but they did some work on their plant, spent significant funds to update the plant because where it was located was a flood zone. The next flooding cycle, the plant was safe, but the supply chain was interrupted because there was no partnership between industry and government. And the supply chain, the network, the roadway was not supported. So the plant was safe, but they could not get things out or in because the community where they resided was flooded. So it's a partnership. And these are some of the things that we're seeing come out in the national adaptation plans. Engagement with civil society actors, engagement with local governments, engagement with international and local financiers. We have to own adaptation individually and collectively. It cannot be a case where we just think that, okay, it's on the government to develop a plan and put it in place. But we also cannot divorce it from the development planning process at both national and subnational levels. Otherwise, it becomes siloed and it will not be funded, and we will be here 10 years after this asking what has happened. So there has to be an understanding that we also as individuals have to be a part of that process to inform the decisions that are being taken. Let me pause here for the time.
Thanks so much, Orville. O Orville nos lembra que as populações historicamente marginalizadas.
Orville reminds us that historically marginalized populations have, for quite some time, been coping with the deterioration of the climate changes. They have been doing what they can. They have been coping as best possible, despite the sheer lack of infrastructure, etc., which really helps me, leads me into my next question to Sinea. We know that the indigenous cosmovisions or world visions, to a certain extent, assume adaptation as an existential condition in this endless dance of upholding a harmonious dance in the dynamic balance with nature itself. How exactly do you think indigenous peoples have adapted themselves to climate change, and what would you say is at stake for the indigenous peoples as regards climate adaptation? And also, what are the main barriers? What main barriers have you had to overcome to access climate funding?
Good morning, everyone. I was already introduced, but I am also the coordinator of Indigenous Committee for Climate Change at a national level. I am also co-president of the Indigenous Caucus, this big global forum for climate change of indigenous peoples within the UNFCCC. So this is a very important issue for us, indigenous peoples. First, because the first adaptation is reaching this space. We need to adapt to get here, to bring the voice of indigenous peoples and how we are addressing this subject in our communities in these territories, in indigenous lands as a whole. Today, I have a more global voice, but I am also speaking as Brazil. And it's very important for us to bring this to this space. The prior panel and this panel are very important. We are listening to scientific issues, financing issues, very important data that we need to have at this moment in which we are focusing on adaptation. I come from the community. I come from doing studies on the ground in the communities, observing indigenous communities to see how we can adapt to the impact of climate change. So, in that sense, I brought to you as a gift this indigenous adaptation plan that is almost ready, a plan to face climate change. I've been working with communities in Roraima for many years now. In 2015, we presented the first adaptation plan at a time when Brazil's adaptation plan was being reviewed. We had a certain advocacy in the committee of the PNGATI and also in the Indigenous Committee for Climate Change. which at the same time was a happy and a sad moment because there was no chapter in this plan for indigenous and local communities. But today we do, and we also have the Brazil Climate Plan. We participated in some meetings, but I still think that the participation of indigenous people and local communities is a bit weak. We have a lot of experience for an adaptation to share. And I've been working with science for a long time, but also with indigenous science and the people, and we need to bring these things together to ensure adaptation. Adaptation cannot be conducted apart from mitigation. Speaking about the work that I've been doing, we are currently in the 4th adaptation plan. But where does this come in Brazil's adaptation plan? It's a big effort. We know that indigenous adaptation was sectorized by the MTI, and we were able to give our contributions. But it's very relevant for us when we bring plants that come from the grounds of the community, made by people who are living these situations and adapting to climate events in their communities. So if we open the plan, we will see from water that has become warmer, fish that have disappeared, and the fact that you can no longer plant crops at the same period according to our traditional ethnic, ecological timeframes. And our plans, our indigenous plans, brings a lot of information in this sense. And we look to scientists in the academy, and I went to the academy to see how to work with indigenous affairs together with traditional a scientific approach. And I'm very grateful for having been able to do so because it allowed me to work better putting these things together in a course that works a lot with the communities and indigenous peoples. I was able to bring these two things together to expand my experience. And at this time in which we are working towards COP30, we have with us, inside us, the information that we bring from all the other COPs. So I went to Glasgow and I asked myself, how will these resources come to Brazil? I was worried with Brazil. I wanted to know what mechanisms were going to be applied and what mechanisms would actually reach indigenous peoples. We're speaking about adaptation, and we're speaking about climate finance as well. Then how will these mechanisms reach indigenous peoples to empower what they're already doing? Because before knowing what adaptation was in 2011, we started by deciding that we wanted to make a plan to face climate change. It was not adaptation at the time because indigenous people understand that they need to face the problem. And I used to joke during the work that we were doing, saying that we don't want to adapt to what other people are doing. We know that adaptation takes place in our daily lives. You may not realize this, but those who are in the forest cannot press the button of their air conditioning. So we know that many times with the very high temperatures, we're much beyond 1.5 degrees. And how were those people able to resist in these high temperatures, which killed people? And I'm sure that there are no studies about how many animals died, how many medicinal plants died with this big drought in the Amazon that has been in place for more than 3 years. And we were taking all of that and thinking about El Niño and La Niña. But scientifically speaking, La Niña and El Niño have already been affected. These are natural events, but they have already been affected as well by global warming. So we also need to think about all of these things. And what I have done is taken all the work we have done so far and internationalized it. So for me, the platform for indigenous peoples and local communities is special space for participation of local peoples and communities within the UNFCCC. I put in this example of a mechanism for speaking about climate mitigation, climate change adaptation with indigenous people and local communities, together with UNFCCC and their scientists, which are very renowned and are researching the climate, but that also need to talk to indigenous scientists about the solutions. And it's very important to bring that to this room, because if we are saying that COP30 will be in Brazil, the main focus is adaptation. We need to be ready to know how all of this work will be financed. And this at all levels, not just for indigenous peoples. It's for the cities, it's for industry, it's for energy. We speak a lot about energy and the just transition. How can we ensure justice? And justice for whom? All of these things were addressed in our work. In negotiation tables where we see negotiators of Brazil doing their job, well, we are there behind the scenes providing all the information, and we're making it clear that indigenous peoples are extremely relevant for this negotiation. When you're negotiating climate finance, you need to remember how this mechanism can make sure that indigenous peoples can receive resources to continue strengthening what they're already doing. Even so, I ask myself every day, even if we in Brazil do our homework, reduce deforestation, reduce wildfires, find a way for all sectors to adapt, still I ask myself whether what happens if the other countries don't fulfill their agreements. I think that biodiversity in Brazil will die. The tipping point in the Amazon depends on us, yes, but we all need to do our homework. This is urgent. And if the countries don't do their homework, if they don't achieve the targets that they agreed on in the Paris Agreement, for instance, then we are doomed to suffer. And we heard here about the poor, about indigenous people, about quilombola communities. These are the first ones that will suffer. It's true. Those who are connected to nature are the first ones to suffer. I have the intention of conducting a study of the entire Amazon and to prepare a plan to face climate change in the Amazon and in all biomes, to put together with the Brazil plan so that we can make sure that the wishes of the indigenous communities and Amazon communities are reflected. And speaking of the NDCs, we will soon see how they are doing. As I said, I'm really in favor of the Bonn Convention. That's where we take all these actions to be negotiated. We are working on indigenous NDCs because we understand that the demarcation of indigenous lands is a way of countering climate change, because these are the lands in which biodiversity is taken care of. We need to bring information of all these things that we are discussing. You may not find this relevant, but between the Biodiversity Climate Convention, the Climate Convention, and the Desertification Convention, we have a series of actions that need to be brought together because they are all affecting indigenous communities. All these things are affecting indigenous communities. We need to have a plan that actually produces results, not just for indigenous peoples, because this effort is global. In order for us to achieve important results for all sectors and for all peoples, it is only globally that we will be able to do so, that we will be able to ensure the rights of the peoples guaranteed within all the spaces provided by the UNFCCC. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Agradeço a sua fala contundente, inspiradora. Eu acho que
Thank you for your strong words, very inspiring words. I think that's what we're here for sure. Now we're going to speak about another sector of the population that has been coping despite everything that's happening. Ambassador, women are the lifeline of any community anywhere in the world, with their culture of care that serve as a counterpoint for the culture of violence, of depredation and profit that is everywhere. We know that women are the most impacted, disproportionately so, by climate change. So I'd like to ask you how gender inequality affects climate vulnerability? How do public policies and adaptation programs, how can they be studied to structure and empower women and girls? And what needs to change in climate governance to ensure an adaptation approach that is more inclusive? Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to start by greeting all of you who are here with us or those who are following us in YouTube. I would like to thank Talano and Natalie for the invitation and all my sister panelists and other panelists. I'm very happy to be here. This is the first event in a very important year for Brazil and for the planet. And the position that I hold, I'm the High Representative for Gender Issues, is a consequence of the reflection of the multi-annual plan of 2025-2027 in prioritizing gender and race and foreign policy. So I'm very happy to be able to share this space and these reflections with you. Your questions, Lorenzo, are very important. The first thing that I need to share with you is the vision of intersectionality in foreign policy in Brazil. When we participate in this type of events, we always leave full of energy and happy, but also a bit afflicted because there seems to be a lack of sense of where we should be going to, what should happen. The real world is harsh, and I need to speak about the complexity of negotiating adaptation with a gender approach and intersectionality. But maybe I have more to add in this aspect. As Lorenzo said, we know that women suffer more the impact of climate change because there is a structural inequality. Women have less access to income. Women have more precarious access to jobs, have less access to credit. So they suffer the impacts of climate change more as well. As it happens in Brazil, women don't suffer the impacts of climate change equally. They suffer the impacts according to the color of their skin, to where they live, to sexual orientation, whether they have some type of special needs. These factors are overlapping, and they overlap other issues as well, such as gender inequality. For us, our position is very clear. Our negotiators speak very strongly in climate negotiations on this position, but not everybody thinks like this. Not everybody sees these things equally. And we need to find a consensus with just 190 countries to be able to advance. Let me give an example, race. This is very important for Brazil. Black women and indigenous women. In Europe, race on the whole comes in when we think about immigration and xenophobia. These are very different situations. We have to deal with them in negotiations as well. So what would be necessary for us to make sure that women enter as agents of change in the center of climate policies with a cut of intersectoriality? I have an important data to provide from Orwell's organization, which I read preparing for today. Only 16% of national adaptation plans consider women as agents of change. I didn't have that information. I thought it was very sad and difficult. That's not how we see things. In the climate plan, we speak about, we have cross-cutting climate justice and gender issues. Last year, we provided a first NDC that is very solid, and that includes gender issues. In the multi-annual plan, the last PPA, we have gender issues cross-cutting all climate policies according to our political views and will to advance. In the negotiations in Belém, when we negotiate the Gender Action Plan, we are going to take the matter of indigenous and Black women specifically, but for that, we will also need to advance in Bonn, which we already heard about in this panel. Will be a very important moment for negotiations. Well, that's basically it for now. Thank you.
Bom, então, eu acho que todos nós aqui
Well, that
concordamos
said, I think we all agree that the adaptation agenda needs to be accelerated,
nos próximos anos, né,
projecting the next years. What do you think, each of you, what do you think should be the next steps to ensure the necessary transformation in this agenda? Let me start with you, Sinea, asking how to bring the knowledge of indigenous communities to accelerate adaptation. How can we do that in practical aspects? Yes, it's important to speak practically about how to bring in our wisdom. Well, first, it needs to be recognized in these spaces, especially where negotiations take place. I have to say that at some moments in time, representing Brazil, I was advising people, speaking through the platform of indigenous peoples and local communities. So that's not a barrier. If we have negotiators that we can work with to ensure this discussion, that's good, because although our movements are outside the COP and are legitimate, the important thing is what will be on the document of the COP. That's how it is. I've been following COP since 2011. So we are very anxious to see the final document produced by the COP, to see what is going to be reflected of what was negotiated and discussed by the negotiators. So that's a first step. Well, I need to say that these conferences are extremely important, and if we want to have relevance in these discussions, we need to meet with the negotiators and show them some of the solutions that we want to have for adaptation, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities. I think that's very important. And something else is to recognize indigenous science. I've already done that. So how can we do it? I took it into the platform. We had official meetings with the platform. We had representatives from various countries, and we were able to show our science as a mechanism built by indigenous peoples. What mechanisms? Well, adaptation plans produced by the indigenous peoples of Brazil, life plans, land management plans, consultation plans, making sure that this started having an effect in these spaces, showing them where to find these documents. People are asking where to find them. We are doing everything we can to have an impact in these discussion spaces. It's very important for us to work at advocacy in this sense, and indigenous peoples have been achieving more space in these forums. The Indigenous Caucus, the platform of indigenous peoples and local communities, which entered the Paris Agreement. This was a big achievement. So there is no single recipe for doing these things. Each person has his or her own way of working, and we try to share this information with people in many parts of the world. And speaking about women, it's important to say that the studies we have conducted on indigenous adaptation, we have seen that women are more sensitive to feeling the impacts of climate change because they deal directly with water, with forests, when they look for resources to do their handicrafts. And it's very important for us to bring this into the matter of adaptation. Well, that's what we do. That's what we have been doing, and trying to see where we could have a greater impact. And it's very important to share this with you. These are the things we discuss. And our supporters are also extremely important, I have to say, for us to reach these spaces, because we don't really receive enough resources from public policies. We should be able also to be there to speak for ourselves, but we'd like to support those. We'd like to applaud those who have made an effort to support us. And we're doing our best to adapting and speaking to those who are inside the country and those who are outside. And I refer to the publication that will be launched soon, where we refer to discussions within the UN FCC. Climate change is a reality for all of us, and adaptation is essential. And when we speak about this in the UN, this is very clear. Thank you.
Espaços, embaixadora, como é que a gente cria as condições dentro de uma visão de aceleração?
Microphone, please. Talking about the need to occupy certain spaces and forums, how would you say, Ambassador, can women actually take on the central stage on this agenda? Microphone, please. Microphone, please. Expanding, scaling up, and further deepening the implementation or means of implementation by capacity building plus technology. We must make progress in this regard. Adaptation funds must find their way onto the developing countries as well as to the populations at the front line. There are many bureaucratic hurdles. The process is very difficult. Not only are the funds concentrated on mitigation only, but they have a hard time finding their way to the target countries. And we also have to mainstream the historically marginalized populations, Black people, indigenous peoples, women. That is what we need, what we must do. Microphone, please. The interpreters are having a hard time. The microphone is failing. What actually happens at the negotiating room? Thank you so much. Still, we're getting some interference. Apparently, the battery is not working properly. As I was saying, what happens in the world also happens in the negotiating room. These are not separate universes. When you see extreme radical stances and climate denialism, of course, the gender discussions become much more difficult. Just to give you some examples, while in Baku, and while negotiating the Lima work program, we managed to renew it for another 10 years. And we were able to introduce girls, in addition to just women, as well as the need to break down data by gender and by age group. That was some progress. On the other hand, however, we experienced some setback when it came to funding. We had to give up gender and accept women. I mean, the kind of things that happen, which also indicate what I can perhaps highlight as being a second problem. In other words, the fragmentation among negotiators. In the case of Brazil, we have one and the same team, and we try to, of course, keep it cohesive as a team. So those who negotiate gender also cover funding, etc. But that is not what happens among other delegations. So very often, a given delegation follows on, for example, with the Lima Renewal Action Program agenda and the need to include girls and the need for data, broken down data to feed into any climate change. But then again, a second negotiator who covers funding ends up leading to a setback. So I believe that countries' engagement at a high political level by attaching greater unity in terms of the different stances, positions, and views in the negotiating rounds would help us ensure that negotiation rounds can be more fluid and more cohesive in the end of the day. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Formal national adaptation plans, countries are invariably adapting to a greater or lesser extent. As we think about the next few years and the need to accelerate this agenda, how can NAPS be more agile and more efficient so that we actually adapt at the pace and the depth that is necessary?
I think you've just asked me the million-dollar question. To be agile, the NAPS have to be fully mainstreamed, both at national and subnational level. To be agile and practical, NAPS have to be supported in a way that they respond to the immediate challenges. In order to go forward, I mean, there's a lot that's happening, and we have examples that we can look at. If you look at recently with Panama, they had to relocate a group of indigenous people that were on a particular island. It was a combination of two things. It was both a population issue, so there's a development challenge, but then there was a sea level rise and attendant climate change impacts. So not be divorced from other processes. Otherwise, they will serve no purpose. They have to have champions. I think earlier when Minister was speaking, she spoke about the narratives. We've been talking about 1.5 to save our lives. And that has been a mantra, especially with SIDS, from way back in 2010. A lot of persons have forgotten about that and what it means. But if you go into the islands, then you get a better understanding of what that means. It means, therefore, for other countries, they also have to look at what does 1.5 mean for them. They have to be able to get the champions out to speak about what that is in their local communities. So it comes through theater, it comes through music, literature, etc. That is how you're going to make adaptation practical, real, and agile. Because all of these are then going to be feeding into and or responding to the national adaptation plans that have been developed. It cannot be a mouthpiece. So it has to be financed. Unfortunately, we know the global challenge that we have where finance is concerned. At the last COP, we were far away from what developing countries were asking for. And as we miss the targets, that number is going to grow. We're seeing a lot of challenges geopolitically now. And that means that the financing window is going to get even more challenging every day. So it means that we have to be practical and look internal to some extent on what it is that we can do. How can we prioritize immediate, urgent actions and find the resources to support it? It means, therefore, that we have to figure out how do we speak with the private sector? How do we understand their language and be able to articulate adaptation in a way that it can provide return on investment that means something to them? The issue here, especially with the private sector, is that we need to get them in the process, a part of the decision-making process, but also recognize that their bottom line, because the private sector speaks to the money, the profits, but we have to recognize, get them in to understand that their bottom line will be lost if they do not take action in communities on the ground where they're working to support and protect their supply chains and pipelines. The people who work for them are essential. Their input into economies is only big for them when it comes to the profits. But they will not be able to have profits if they're not supporting in adaptation. So to make it agile, we just have to be practical and realistic. And we have to send that message out at the global and the local levels.
Excellent. I really appreciate your point on the interplay between culture and adaptation. And to finish this round, I'd like to ask Irene, how can nature and its nexus with food systems accelerate adaptation? And since Orville talked about the private sector, if you can also help us understand what role the private sector has played or needs to play in order for us to get to where we need to be.
Excellent, and thank you so much for that question. I want to build off of a comment that Sinais just made and take a step back on why nature and food system transformation is relevant. First of all, nature and food system transformation really bring to life the synergies between mitigation and adaptation. And also, it also brings to life why the global is so important, this global approach to adaptation. It's not only local. Supply chains, migration, and ecosystems do not know geopolitical boundaries. So we need to seize this opportunity that we have ahead of us. Nature, the World Economic Forum report just reminded us that 55% of global GDP depends on nature. Extremely relevant that we prioritize this. And food system transformation is driving 80% of global emissions. It demands 70% of water demand globally. And it produces, 500 million small farm holders are completely dependent on food system transformation on a daily basis. So these are two incredibly relevant topics to touch upon. And the biodiversity crisis and the failure of addressing food system transformation will only amplify conflict. It will amplify hunger, and it will amplify migration and economic instability and desertification, as Sinais also reminded us. However, a people-centered conservation and restoration, food system transformation, will help us thrive in more yields for business and financial institutions. The return upon investments are already proven, and it also provides more jobs, lower costs, and enhance resilience. For example, in Brazil alone, the target of 12 million hectares to be restored will produce 2.5 million jobs. This is so powerful in terms of economic returns. So in terms of the pathway that you were elevating, three key elements that I would highlight. First is that we need the people-centered approach that we've all talked about. It needs to have profound ownership, and as Orville mentioned, it needs to be mainstreamed across all levels. It needs to have a system approach where we have policies that enable the short, medium, and long term. And then specifically, in terms of nature and food, we need to protect ecosystems with a people-centered approach, so we need to halt deforestation and reverse land conversion, as 196 countries just adopted in the global stocktake. We need to restore the degraded lands, also reflected there, and through regenerative agriculture. Thirdly, we need to pivot to sustainable agriculture, using current lands that are being used for agriculture, and also restore degraded lands. So producing less emissions, using less natural resources, and increasing profits while reducing risk. And lastly, we need to reduce demand of food that is not benefiting people, climate, and nature. We need to pivot to transition to more nature-positive foods in which we all thrive. And we need to reduce food loss and waste. And I think food banks play a pivotal role, and I want to recognize the Global Methane Hub and the Global Food Bank Network for that. So in terms of finance, I just add to what we've all been mentioning, that we need to value nature. We need to increase financial flows, make them fair, make them direct to indigenous people, local communities, and prioritize women-led solutions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. A gente chegou aqui no finalzinho do nosso painel e tentar recapitular tudo que foi falado aqui é uma missão um pouco inglória, mas eu vou tentar só frisar alguns pontos que eu acho que poderiam servir como resquícios, né, para a nossa contemplação, nossas reflexões pós-evento. A gente ouviu aqui que a adaptação não é...
This panel session, we have heard reference to the fact that adaptation is not simply a local issue, but that it is based on a more interdependent approach, and that's such a global issue. We have also heard reference to the fact that Belém may become an upward spiral that will unlock several points on the adaptation agenda. We have also heard reference to the fact that, unlike what has been said out there, countries in their vast majority are indeed adapting themselves. And we have also heard that the challenge consists in integrating these decision-making processes into dialogue processes among national and subnational institutions. We have also heard about the exponential cost of inaction failing to act. And we have also heard that an ineffective way to address adaptation is to isolate it in the local territories. We have also heard about the need to integrate indigenous peoples as part of the rationale as to how we face these adaptation plans, and we want to mainstream indigenous peoples into decision-making processes. We have also heard about the need for an intersectional approach, today more than ever before. Especially given today's deep geopolitical arrangements, the novel geopolitical arrangements of today. And we must now attach value to the nature we are part of. And trying to find a common denominator, I have noticed that all of the panel members, all of the panelists here on the stage have this systems-wide approach, and that is perhaps the key and most strategic approach for us to no longer look at the mitigation and adaptation agenda as if they were opposing elements or components of the agenda. Because if we truly view and understand the planet to be a living system, every living system can only be understood on the basis of patterns, relations, interrelations, and contacts. Therefore, the interrelations or interrelationships become plain and clear. So, to wrap up this session, on behalf of all of those who have suffered and still do suffer as a result of climate change, I want to say that you are to be congratulated for everything you do, and you're not alone. At least all of us here are working together with you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, the NLO Institute, and may you all have a great event.
Uau! Eu só falo uau hoje.
I'm on a wow mode today. Anyway, this was amazing. Thank you so much, Lorenzo. And thank you all colleagues who have attached so much content, very informative session. To those of you who have just joined us in the past few minutes, welcome everyone. The festival is going on. We will now have a panel session which will last about 1 hour. And for those of you who are with us on YouTube, let me tell you that we will have a different link on the afternoon, and you can of course keep on watching us live. And we will share the new link on the video description you're watching. Thank you very much. We have hundreds of people with us online, and that is wonderful. It is now my honor to introduce the next panel.
Eu espero que realmente a gente possa concretizar.
The next panel is something that I hope we will be able to materialize by means of a decision in the upcoming COP. We expect that the UAE, as we know, have geared their efforts and attention to the so-called global adaptation indicators. As you can see, we have a lot of super powerful women here on the stage. I'd like to invite Ana Mulia with the A3G. She will be our moderator. Thank you so much, Ana. I'd also like to call upon other great partners, including Pilar Bueno and Leticia Leobe, Natalie, and Angela Ribeiro from Colombia. Thank you so much, and let's keep up the good work.
Are they on? I don't want to hear myself that much.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here today. Yes, as Natalie was saying, I'm Anna from E3G. We are a climate think tank that focuses on climate diplomacy, and I particularly work in leading our work in adaptation diplomacy. And I'm very grateful to Talanoa and all the organizing team for just the incredible work that you can all see here today. It's really so exciting to see adaptation kind of taking the center stage for once, and I really have high hopes that it will be the key issue for for COP30. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. This panel will focus on the Global Goal on Adaptation, which was established under the Paris Agreement to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability across the globe, and therefore supporting sustainable development in developing countries. The global goal aims to link local and global adaptation efforts and provide parameters to measure and guide progress. At COP28 in Dubai, we saw a historic moment where after 8 years of work, the global goal was adopted by launching the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience, and that set up the framework for the GGA with 11 targets that comprised everything from thematic targets around water security and food, but also dimensional targets around, for example, risk assessments and planning, etc. At COP28, then there was also the launch of a work program that would finalize the operational side of the goal by developing indicators to measure progress on these targets, right? So the idea is that these targets would provide that umbrella for global efforts around adaptation, but of course linking it with local efforts, as we've heard other speakers say, it's super important. So that work program that was launched at COP28 is wrapping up this year and should be finalized by COP30, and therefore we will hopefully have an operational and fit for purpose global goal on adaptation, and that is very exciting. But also, obviously, we're at the beginning of the year, there's still a lot of negotiations ahead and lots of back and forth on what the indicators will be and what the potential of the global goal is, and how we can make sure it's not just one more framework that sits on a shelf, but really driving real progress on the ground. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to hear a bit also about the challenges for this year, but also the opportunities. And I couldn't imagine a better panel to have this conversation with. Here next to me, we have Dr. Pilar Bueno, who is the director and founder of Argentina 1.5, and also the secretary for climate change of the city of Rosario, Argentina. We also have Ángela Rivera, lead adaptation negotiator for Colombia and ILEC, and advisor to the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. We also have Leticia Leobet, social scientist and advisor at Geledes Instituto for Black Women, and Natalie Flores, a former vice chair of the SABSTA under the UNFCCC, and vice president of Carbon Markets StoneX Group. So, as Natalie said, a full, powerful panel of women. So we're going to do 2 rounds of questions with 5 minutes each, and then we'll have a lightning round with 2 minutes per panelist. And we're going to get started with Pilar, who's been following the process of the GGA for a long time. And she's, I really want to hear from you, Pilar. The global goal was created or, imagined at the Paris Agreement almost a decade ago, but we're only making real tangible progress towards its implementation now. How did we get here, and what is the full potential of a GGA at launch at COP30?
Thank you very much, Anna, for your introduction, and thank you to Institute Talanoa and Natalie and all the team for this gentle invitation to really share with you some ideas today. It's my pleasure. And after amazing speakers today is difficult enough, but I will do my best. With respect to this question in particular, maybe to say that short answer to the first part of the question is Global South fighting forever for adaptation, and global goal on adaptation as part to make more visible the impacts, the needs of developing countries, what we are already experiencing. and what is growing and we really need to face with the resources, as many others said before me. Long answer is that, as you said, the developing countries pursue in the Paris Agreement to really have this global goal on adaptation as a global vision for adaptation, a collective effort, the collective objective for everybody on adaptation, as we have our 1.5. So the global goal on adaptation was ambition as that 1.5 for adaptation in many ways. For some people was more a vision, for other people was very tangible, and as negotiators at that moment, and negotiators of the G77 and China in particular, we really, and I see Irene and many others at that fight at that moment, it was even to create among ourselves what the GGA was. And the issue is that after the Paris Agreement itself, we confront again the truth that many countries didn't want to include it in the APA agenda. That is the first phase of implementation from Morocco to Katowice. The truth about adaptation, that's where we are, that's the fight. So developing countries again saying we really need to implement the global goal on adaptation. This is a central piece of our fight. And we couldn't. Even with all our strength and trying together, we couldn't. So the Adaptation Committee really played a critical role in order to develop that discussion, because we couldn't even discuss before what the goal was, how to implement, and I see Ali, we were in the Adaptation Committee together at that moment, really to say, guys, we need to have the discussion. What is to be, I mean, these three components, adaptive capacity, resilience, vulnerabilities, what are the difficulties? After that in Madrid, we had a decision following the political will of the Adaptation Committee. And we had a mandate, and we had a technical report. Why that technical report was so important? Because it shows very clearly the challenges, methodological challenges, political challenges, conceptual ones, saying, okay, guys, it's not so simple at home. And I'm saying that even from a city perspective. It's not so simple when we plan and identify and prioritize adaptation actions to say which are the limits between an action that contribute to reduce vulnerability and at the same time contribute to adaptive capacity. So that kind of methodological issues and political issues about the lack of will of many countries saying, oh, I don't want to talk about this because this is to talk about money, and I don't want to assess money with respect to the collective efforts of adaptation. So that is part of the path that we did together, and right now I also need to recognize, as Anna said, that it comes from this region and that the solution came, a solution that of course is not perfect, but is a way to open the black box. The solution was that framework that is not so simple to eat in terms of the technicalities behind what is the framework, but then we have 11 targets. And the framework was the way to open that black box. And now we have 11 targets for the world to assess progress, to understand better what is happening on water, on agriculture, on poverty, what is happening on health systems, so, and many other issues. So now we need to really focus on how we are doing together on this. We don't have more excuses, and that's a very important word for today, because for at least 30 years, we heard a lot of excuses about adaptation. It's too technical, it's too difficult, it's too local. No, it's local, yeah, we have technical issues, as in all the other agendas of climate change. But we need to do it together, we don't have more time. So the Global Goal on Adaptation is a way, is a path that we have together in order to assess progress and also to achieve together what we need to achieve. That is related to the nature of these 11 targets. So that's the long answer to avoid excuses, and this is what we have together today. Thanks.
Thank you, Pilar. It's really so impressive to hear kind of the road here and how developing countries have really been driving this forward. It's incredibly impressive, and it takes me to my next question for Angela. ILAC has actually, in particular, played a key role in securing the GGA and shaping the negotiations. What outcome does ILAC hope will happen at COP30, and what would this outcome mean for adaptation efforts in the region?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's always a pleasure to join you and to see new faces and old faces in this event. My appreciation to the Talanoa Dialogue, the Minister of Environment of Brazil, and all those who make possible to be here in this event. I just want to start by saying that what is my perspective in terms of this COP beyond the GGA. And I have to say that I joined the comments made by some of the panelists that we need to look the whole picture of the negotiation. We do not want to negotiate in silos. And without any mitigation action, we have to increase our efforts on adaptation. The IPCC is clear now. We passed the limits of adaptation, and we are in losses and damages. So with that, I want to say that we expect as ILAC that this conference of the parties will have, or we expect that we should have, a strong focus on adaptation agenda as the main outcome for this COP and for Latin American countries. Now I'm moving to the question on the GGA, and perhaps just let me list some of the key areas that I want to see as Colombia, and I think most of ILAC countries, of course, we're still discussing our national positions, and we are preparing ourselves for the negotiations. Let me start on the indicators. Of course, we fully support the idea to reach an agreement on the indicators. That's the only way to see where we are, what do we want to achieve, and where do we want to go. But the issue is not to adopt the indicators, it's how to measure the progress and how to identify the trends on adaptation. We cannot adopt 100 indicators and allow all parties to provide information in terms of the indicators that they want. How can you compare? Of course, we are against comparison, but you need to see the trends on adaptation. So at least we need to adopt a common set of indicators that could help us to track progress collectively in terms of adaptation action. That's the main outcome that we want to see, to measure progress collectively. We do not want a decision that uses the indicators process as a process to identify which country is more vulnerable or which country is suffering in a bad way the effects of climate change. We are all vulnerable, and the realities of adaptation in our countries are different. It's country-driven, local specific, so we cannot compare the countries in terms of climate change effects. That's my first point. My second point is we want to see a decision that is clear in terms of how to enhance adaptation, action, and support. If we do not enhance action and support, how can we implement actions at national and local level and involve the actors that are working to tackle climate change? My third point is the monitoring and evaluation systems and learning systems. That's the main difficulty, and I have to say that in Colombia, and I suppose in all Latin American countries and around the world, in the global south, we do not have monitoring and evaluation systems. And we saw that when we report our BTRs, biennial transparency reports. We have national adaptation plans, we have national communications, we have adaptation communications, but we do not have systems in place that could give us the information that we need in terms of if we are implementing adaptation actions effectively. We need to measure the adaptation actions, not to say that we comply with the plan. It's easy to, it's not easy, but let's say, in comparison with implementation and to ensure that we are effectively implementing the adaptation action, there is a huge gap there. So I think we want to see, I know that it's going to be really difficult that the UNFCCC provide us financial support or developed countries to put in place everywhere around all countries, developing countries, monitoring and evaluation systems. But we need to increase the capacity of the countries to work on it, because otherwise we cannot track progress, we cannot provide inputs to the global stocktake, and we cannot see the trends for future adaptation action. And finally, let me highlight the finance and means of implementation. I think that's the most, an additional gap. We have been fighting for many years, as was mentioned by Pilar, not only in terms of we need to work on the adaptation track, but also on finance. Yes, we adopted a new collective quantified goal on finance, which is far, far away of the developing country needs. But what we need to discuss now is, okay, we have 1.3 trillion goal, which is mobilization goal. I have to say that I don't feel comfortable with that goal, just for the record, but I could be the portion of this goal for adaptation, and what kind of portion of this goal will be for losses and damages. Because it's not only mobilization and it's not only mitigation action, it's also adaptation. And which part of this 1.3 trillion is gonna go to adaptation? We adopted in Glasgow a decision that says that we are gonna double adaptation finance. And in Baku, we took a decision, or we adopted a report that we already comply, or we already receive the doubling adaptation finance, which is not true. I don't see it. I mean, at this point, Colombia is looking to find financial support for the implementation of our national adaptation plan, and I think everybody's in the same place. So at this point, we need to ensure that the goal consider a specific amount of money for adaptation action. And my final comment, those are the main areas that I want to see in the final decision, but my final comment is the finance issue is for all developing countries. I feel sad when I see in the room, in the negotiation rooms, that we start fighting between the Global South in terms of who is more vulnerable, who deserves the financial support. It's not fair that we, as developing countries, fight between us for financial support. We do not create a problem of climate change. We are facing it. And Latin American countries are the countries who are taking the lead in our NDCs to tackle climate change. Colombia raised their ambition in the NDC when we decided to have emissions reductions of the 51% of our emissions reductions. It's a goal that we established, but we don't know how we are going to comply with that. But beyond that, we are all vulnerable and we are all facing the effects of climate change. The fight is for all of us. It's not who's more vulnerable. We are all suffering the effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think you bring a truly powerful point around, you know, this is, adaptation really is around addressing climate injustice, right? And to talk a little bit about that, I'm going to go to Leticia as well, who will be responding in Portuguese, so if you want to put your headphones on as well. As we said, adaptation is at the heart of climate justice, and there are expectations that the GGA will help stimulate finance for adaptation efforts in developing countries. How can parties ensure that this new goal is not just one more technical framework, but actually driving equity in the real world?
Bom dia a todas as pessoas. Muito obrigada, primeiro. Agradeço ao Talanoa, em nome de Guilherme.
First of all, I want to thank the Talanoa Institute on behalf of the Black Women Institute. It's the Black Women's Institute. And in the last COP conference, which also helps us understand the frail terrain of the multilateral system at this point in time. We have seen that developed countries have neglected certain standards and rules, such as, for example, the point on shared but differentiated responsibilities, which has a direct impact on the overall funding flows and also on the aim at achieving a more balanced and equitable perspective. Furthermore, more specifically, considering public funding to developing countries, the fact is that we must ensure that the indicators serve as a guide to affirm criteria that will not further weaken developing countries. We must consider capacity building, we must consider technology transfer. And I think this has happened, or this is something that has already been referred to in those or among those who spoke before me, which clearly shows how important the topic is. Considering the strategies described by Angela, we don't want to boost the rivalry or competition among countries in the global south or at the global level, but rather considering the multilateral context in which we live today, we want these to be indicators to further strengthen these alliances and further strengthen the narratives espoused by the global south. Yes, there are quite a few challenges, some of which have already been pinpointed or mapped out. It is important to highlight the role of civil society, and I hope I will be able to speak a little more about that later. And we will certainly need to engage in a negotiating process marked by a substantial level of political coordination, political orchestration, a mission for our diplomats, which will certainly come under great pressure and which will certainly be demanded by Brazilian civil society, especially at this point in time. But we will not only demand the action from you, but we will also provide you with inputs. Now, in order to expand our technical dimension, I mean, Pilar talked about the technical agenda. People are not always willing to talk about it, but to be able to expand the technical dimension and achieve equity in practice, we must go back to what I mentioned earlier, the climate justice perspective, which takes into account the structural inequalities. And a central point on the adaptation agenda is the need to bear in mind that we are talking about people. We're talking about people's lives in the end of the day. And these people have a race, they have an ethnicity, they have a gender, they have an age, they have a territory. And these are the conditioning factors that ultimately determine their place in the world, their position in the world, and the way whereby they will be impacted or not impacted by the climate change. Those with the climate crisis. At the Black Women's Institute, we have made efforts structurally and more broadly to ensure greater visibility for the community of African descendants, meaning approximately 300 million people in the world altogether, considering the under-reporting factor, because the point on data is yet another problem we also experience. So we are talking about a community that is also recognized at the multilateral system by the United Nations organization. When I talk about people of African descent, I'm using the definition established by the expert working group on African descendants within the UN under the human rights umbrella in the UN system. And I'd like to stress the importance of ensuring that this community be given room and space, not only to submit its allegations, because the community of African descendants has been hard hit, not only by the climate change or by the climate crisis, but also by the need to ensure greater visibility of the social technologies developed by these communities, especially as we consider the adaptation agenda. In the end of the day, adaptation for these communities is a matter of survival in the end of the day. So it is important to, of course, look at all of these efforts, recognize all of the efforts that are already underway at the initiative of African descendants, communities of African descendants, as well as indigenous communities and historically marginalized communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. Yeah, definitely believe addressing structural inequalities for survival needs to be at the heart of the GGA, and something that I take away a lot from your intervention is around the implementation, right? And on that, Natalie Flores is going to come in and give us her perspective on how this process will actually translate to that implementation, and how can it deliver all these elements that we're discussing. What does it really mean for countries and vulnerable communities that Leticia was mentioning to have a framework like the Global Goal on Adaptation?
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much, Natalie. We share the same name, and we were climate diplomats together like many years ago. Actually, I was very junior in 2010, 2011, and I learned a lot from Natalie on the negotiations tables, specifically on RED+. So I'm very happy to be here, invited by Talanoa, and of course by her leadership. And I have to make that recognition. Another recognition that I have to make is that this photo is from COP24. And the other thing is that I'm here as now former vice chair of the Science and Technology Bureau of the UN Climate Change, though I still hold the title because I was re-elected in November, but I had the pleasure of joining the private sector after 15 years of service and working for Stonex Group that also have a presence in Brazil, and I'm very happy to be here, you know, in the transition of that capacity, and with that I want to go to the whole implementation framework, right? Because the reason I decided to join the private sector is actually to be able to go beyond what we put in a text and actually deploy climate finance, that it's an urgent need at this point. So I want to make a question before I move forward, and I want to ask the audience who has been in a COP before, in a conference of the party, so you can raise your hand if you've been in a COP before. Okay, and now I want to for you to raise your hand if you belong to the private sector. Raise your hand. Okay, and who belongs to local governments? Raise your hands. Okay, that's the key. So, I want to say so many things. I actually wrote down so many things, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. So, I like to refer to the United Nations as a club of governments. So that's the first thing. We have to understand that the United Nations is the representative that we vote to represent us at global scale. So the first thing to understand is that even though that the whole process, because of the demand of all stakeholders, have created space for all stakeholders to come to the table in their capacity, either as observers, civil society, politicians, or even private sector, what we do when we are at the negotiation tables, and what we did in my specific case until COP29, is to represent the best interests of our communities, right? So I was performing that role, representing the government of the Dominican Republic, which is my country. So with that, I want to make the point that it's your representative that goes to the table and defend like your gremio, ¿cómo se dice gremio?
Your group.
Yeah, so for that, it's important to understand, because any issue that is discussed under the UN climate change or under the whole UN process, or any treaty that involves countries, it's by your representative. So no matter if you are an indigenous group, if you are a private sector group, or a local community, even local governments, you have to be represented by whoever it's designed to do that. So with that, I go back to foreign affairs in Brazil. So Brazil is a huge country, It's federal, and the representation of that federal government to the convention is done by the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the country, even though the implementation of what it is decided in the whole global framework is implemented by other entities in the countries, as the Ministry of Environment, if we talk about nature. And with that, I want to go back to the fact, and the Brazilian leadership, to the fact that the Rio Conventions were decided here in 1992. So in 1987, and probably most of you know this, there was a report that said that we need to tackle destroying nature in different capacities. So we have the problem of desertification, we had the problem of biodiversity, and we have the problem of global warming. I don't know if any of you knew, but climate change, it's a lovism concept. Because yes, climate is changing, but what we are suffering right now, it's a global warming. So that's why we've been tackling under the science-based approach, the fact that the planet is getting warmer. With this, we come to the 5 pillars of the convention, which I actually learned from the Brazilian diplomats back in the days, because we have to differentiate that we have the UN Climate Change Convention, the Kyoto Protocol that we already fulfill its mandate, and now we have the Paris Agreement. And if we don't make the differentiation under these treaties, we cannot understand how we are going to downscale that to any entity that needs to put in place policy to actually make operations in the country cleaner, or to make any stakeholders to come to this transformation. And with that, I want to go to the ultimate goal of the UN Climate Change Convention. Does anybody knows what is the ultimate goal of the Climate Change Convention? Reduce carbon emissions. So, the ultimate goal of the UN Climate Change Convention under its conception in 1992 is reduce carbon emissions. And if we don't make that clear, we cannot understand what role each treaty plays when it was put into place. And sorry for the redundancy, but as you can see, English is not my mother language. So with that, what I want to say is that even though any country can treat the whole global framework with what is leaving a treaty or not, which is a decision that geopolitics and politicians do, we have to understand that the commitments to the convention as a whole are over there. So I want to say so many things, but to try to brief everything that I want to say, I'll leave it to the fact that once we have a decision from the negotiation tables, either from the science and technology body or the implementation body, what we are doing, it's creating a global framework that then it's going to be downscaled to the national framework. And with that national framework, our politicians, the people that we put in office to actually regulate us as private sector or as stakeholders, need to put into place the policy that are going to capitalize that finance that we need. But before I finish, and with this, I just want to be very clear on how the process works, because I think if we don't understand the process, then we don't understand what our role in the process is, right? So in order to tackle that finance need that we have to these pillars of the convention, technology transfer, education, which is named capacity building, mitigation, adaptation, and I said technology transfer, finance, climate finance, we need to put the policies into place. And what are the policies for? The policies are to regulate the private sector in order to make the private sector making their operation, either their operations cleaner or the investment cleaners. And I'll leave it there. But with this, I think it's really important to actually have an appropriation on what our role in the process is and why it's important to see ourselves from Paris to Azerbaijan to Belém, and how this decision are going to shape what we need in the national policies to reach the economic transformation we're trying to do, diversifying from fossil fuels.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to start the second round of... I'm going to start then the second round of questions following up on a point that you made around the private sector. And I think that for a long time, the involvement of the private sector in adaptation finance has been a bit controversial, right? We know that adaptation projects and efforts have a hard time bringing in the private sector. It's been very difficult to make adaptation bankable or investable because, as Leticia mentioned, it often affects vulnerable communities that don't have a private sector or are not attractive enough. There's also, I think, concerns from developing countries around, making profit of climate injustice. So I'd like to hear your opinion then on what do you think of the role of the private sector in the GGA? What are some concrete proposals on how the private sector can be brought in a way that addresses the concerns of developing countries?
Me again. Not enough. No, I'm joking. Okay, I'm going to give the example of my country, the Dominican Republic, because I had the honor of serving before as climate change director. And actually, the role that I'm holding right now as vice president of carbon market and strategic accounts for the private sector comes from what we created. Because if we wouldn't have the global framework, I wouldn't have this role today, because carbon markets came from the whole process. So back to my previous role as climate change director, and the decisions and how to involve the private sector, I'll go to the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund was created by the parties, and it was decided in Cancun in COP16, my first COP. So it was created over there. We have different windows for public sector, private sector, and other stakeholders. And then we work with the UN agencies to actually be able to implement those funds that the big countries, under their compromise to the conventions because of their industrialization, they need to, let's say, compensate small countries. So within a project of the Green Climate Fund, we put together our national adaptation plan in our country. After putting that together within the framework of the convention, the Green Climate Fund, and downscaling the funds with implementation of the United Nations Environmental Program and their Panama office, we were able to put a national decree for climate change adaptation. And after putting the national decree for climate change adaptation, we managed to work with the Association of Municipalities of the Dominican Republic for them to include both in the permits, environmental permits that they need to, they need at municipal level, and then the ones that we needed at the Ministry of Environment at national level to actually measure adaptation on the projects that they put forward to the Ministry of Environment. So every time somebody goes to the Ministry of Environment or the municipalities to ask for an environmental permit established by the law of the Dominican Republic, we put adaptation measure thanks to this project. So now the Dominican Republic, this is talking upon legacy, of course, because I left that role a year and a half ago. Now the government of the Dominican Republic is able to measure the science that the private sector needs to put together every time they need a permit approved, and then the private sector to measure how they are investing in adaptation. Because if you are, for example, we live from tourism, vulnerable communities that live from the coastal marine ecosystem of the Dominican Republic that we also need to protect. But there's a problem. The tourism sector doesn't see environment and tourism together in our country. They see tourism as real estate, right? So what we need to do, educate them on the fact that now they need to follow adaptation measure. And every time a hotel is built in the Dominican Republic, the private sector, either is if it's cement, if it's steel, or if it's, I don't know, any measure from waste energy, they know the investment that they are doing in adaptation. And also another achievement from the global framework that involves adaptation from the finance perspective, it's putting together our country, which other countries have done beautifully, hence Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, with the green taxonomy of our country for the stock exchange market and our banks. So we have a taxonomy that actually opens up tagging within the framework of getting finance from any bank. So we have 2 champion banks in the Dominican Republic that actually have tagging and are measuring adaptation in their investment. And actually the bank, it's like these banks are giving them funds, let's say, faster and easier when they connect the adaptation policy, the national adaptation plan that we presented to the convention, and our national development law in terms of how adaptation is being tackled in that sense. So now our private sector, it's able to actually see where their investment and the income from adaptation, either directly or not, it's seeing over there. And we have a broader issue right now that nobody is looking into. We finalized the Paris Rule Book. We are now in the operationalization of carbon markets globally, but nobody had seen that the decisions of COP26 and COP27 established an adaptation measure of 5% of the levy on carbon markets needs to be destined to adaptation. And Brazil just approved their law on carbon markets. And that means that now, like the whole the global framework in terms of how that money for markets it's going to put in adaptation within the countries, from the federal government to each state to municipalities, needs to be addressed. I'll leave it there.
No, thank you. That was great. And I think all the funds under the convention are looking at carbon markets, given how tight the budgets of public finance are right now. So I think we might hear a bit more about that later in the finance section. Coming back to Leticia, and I love your example, Natalie, and I love that we're getting very real, right? Like, what does this mean on the ground? Leticia, how do you believe that the needs of vulnerable communities then can be reflected in the GGA and in adaptation efforts? And how does this relate to the issues of inequality? And yeah, if you have concrete examples, that would be very helpful as well.
Gracias, Ana. Bem, agora chegou a hora de falar sobre sociedade civil. Mas
Thank you, Anna. The time has come for us to speak about civil society. Now, to provide you with a context, yesterday, in an effort to be optimistic, I joked with Bruna Verissimo, our negotiator of the adaptation agenda, saying that, well, the adaptation agenda might have been the agenda that advanced the most in COP29. We went from a scenario of 5,000 indicators to a definition of a limit of 100. That is where my optimism comes in. At this moment, a very important effort to systematize all this is taking place by the group of experts. And we in civil society have contributed with input and recommendations. When I say civil society, I refer to the more institutionalized organizations that work with advocacy, but I'm also speaking about grassroots organizations and the dialogue that takes place within civil society. I'm referring to social movements, the indigenous movements, the Black movement, Quilombola movement, youth. So we are really looking at these groups that are fully engaged in the process. Based on that, I want to call attention to the fact that It is we as civil society and all these movements who are in constant dialogue with the reality in the grounds, with what's taking place at the local level. And that's why we are very aware of the needs in terms of adaptation, what adaptation is all about. And in that sense, we need to be recognized both in our critical dimension and in our technical dimension, precisely because we need to provide support to the negotiators, those who are involved in the negotiation process. And in that sense, I'd like to avail myself of that space to ask the presidency of the COP to please encourage this. We are leaving context of a COP in which democracy is something totally questionable, and we are going to have a COP in Brazil. So it's very important for us to think about the weight and the quality of the participation of civil society. And when I refer to this, I mean both in the sense of receiving these submissions and this input and sending it to diplomacy, to other areas. We build things collectively, we present results, but also in fighting by the condition that these organizations have the institutional possibility of participating in the COP. What does this mean? Minimally as observers. So in that sense, I'd like to avail myself at this moment to put pressure on those responsible to make sure that this happens, that organizations that have been contributing to the discussion, that have been working in this space, that are in dialogue with grassroots organizations, that are grassroots organizations, have access and have the right to be observers. And this is already a bit limited condition, but it's still important and we want it. And beyond that, I'd also like to reinforce this request because of the current context that we are living in, where we have seen that the human rights agenda has been attacked in many ways. And one of them is weakening the participation of civil society. This became explicit at Baku, where negotiations at a certain point seemed to be taking place in closed doors. We did not have access to information. It became so extreme that I believe that the diplomacy of the most progressive countries at a point were left without access to information themselves. So it's very important for us to reflect about this and to reflect about how the COP will be held in Brazil. We need to have as one of the bases that it is a COP of the people with social participation. And this also answers both to what is necessary to implement the GGA. We can't implement the GGA without knowing the needs and the realities for adaptation, but also building on the fact that we have many expectations coming from the roadmap of Baku to drive forth in Berlin. We need a package of decisions that can deal with those items that, as I said, are connected to the indicators, but also take into account the entire scope of the implementation agenda. And when I refer to that, I cannot but refer to the importance of the national adaptation plans. And I think that's a very important reflection that we need to deepen. The interrelation between national adaptation plans and the GGA, these things have a connection, and there needs to be a connection between them. Although the plans are very much focused on a specific territorial reality or national reality, this is fundamental for us to be able to a certain degree, have a parameter about what the national realities are and how that will guide and subsidize national decisions and indicators that will guide global climate policies. For that, we need to shed light on the matter based on a recognition of the specificities of each land. And this has to do with the process of recognizing, as Sinoa said very powerfully, having given examples of indigenous communities, concrete examples, but it's a recognition of adaptation technologies that I mentioned before. And we really need to delve into these things. I get a feeling by following negotiations and COPs, I've been to 2 COPs before, that when we speak about inequalities, well, this is something that the countries don't really want to speak about. The argument tends to be we're not going to speak about that because each country has its own inequalities. And I think we need to go against that narrative. I think it's an essential role of diplomacy to say, no, we are going to bring the discussion of inequality to the table, and we are going to assess what inequalities we have in common and which ones are specific to each one of us, so that we are able to foster solutions based on the reality of these inequalities, and always reinforcing that the climate agenda has that goal. By building new policies, we will not just encourage the fight against climate change, but also fight to reduce historical inequalities. But as I always say, we cannot do so without taking into account the reality and the voices of people who are constantly impacted by them.
Thank you, Leticia. After having a few COPs without this level of like richness in civil society is so refreshing to see such an engaged and just incredible civil society coming forward and putting the needs of the people at the front. So I really hope that they listen to the voices of civil society and really address this. I mean, as you say, if we don't address inequality, then what are we doing, right? So thank you so much. Coming back to Angela, I think there's, it's been very obvious throughout the panel, but also in conversations throughout the day, that there's this heightened expectation that the GGA will help unlock finance and means of implementation for Latin America and other regions. How do you see that happening? This is a question I have all the time, given the complexity of our geopolitical context right now and the difficulties to unlock public finance. How do you see the role of the GGA there?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think it's the most difficult question that I do not have the answer of that. But just to share some views in terms of what I think, and as Angela, as Colombia. And first, just let me highlight that this COP is really key, not only for adaptation, but for the trust that we have in multilateralism. Why? Because this year is the year that we need to submit our NDCs. And until now, if you look at the NDCs that are already available, there is not the ambition that we need there. That's one thing. And if we want to continue increasing the visibility of this issue of climate, we need to ensure that all countries are in the right path. With that, I want to say, and building on my previous intervention, that it's important to not penalize ambition. We need to push for ambition. And those countries who are showing the willingness to work towards tackling climate action should be part of that kind of recognition. We cannot provide resources to those countries who are doing nothing. Doesn't make sense in reality. So I think the GGA is a good opportunity to recognize the adaptation efforts that we are doing at national level. Most of us, most Latin American countries, if I can say all of us, we already have in place our national adaptation plans with important goals, with goals that are ambitious, and we are trying to implement them. How can we implement if we do not have the resources and means implementation to do so? So in that sense, I think that there is a way. When there is a way, when there is a will, there is a way. Yeah, that's the most important thing. And I think I'm very optimistic. I'm still believing in multilateralism. I think that the GGA will be the opportunity to ensure that some kind, I'm not gonna say rivers of money, because that's the reality that rivers of money are not coming, but resources will be available for adaptation action. But we need to ensure that we have ambitious plans. We have ambitious adaptation communications in our NDCs, that we are showing that we are taking adaptation action at national level. If we just justify that we cannot take any adaptation action because we do not have means of implementation, we are in the wrong path. We cannot say that financial support, if we do not get financial support, I'm not gonna do anything. That doesn't make sense. And you know, those who have been in the negotiation that are highlighting that with any means of implementation, they cannot take any climate action. It doesn't make sense to us. We are doing this for our own countries, for our vulnerable communities, and for those who are suffering the effects of climate change. So with that, I have to say, we have to pass. The GGA, we have to discuss the Baku adaptation roadmap. It was established in the previous COP. We don't know what does it mean. We need to decide what are the modalities of that Baku adaptation roadmap, but this adaptation roadmap is not only for the identification of reviewing or to identify how we can review the indicators, how to track progress, how to establish our monitoring and evaluation systems, but also how to ensure that we create the capacities in our countries to track progress, to create baselines, and to provide information that could help us to identify the global trends on adaptation. So I think that space, in that negotiation of the adaptation Baku roadmap, will be the opportunity to put in place the need to establish or to have clear means of implementation. That's the first point. And the second part that we have is we have the 1.3 trillions goal that we adopted at the previous COP. Again, I'm not happy with that goal, but it's what we have and we need to work on it. And we have been talking since the previous panels that we need to mobilize, and this is a mobilization goal. So we need to ensure that we unlock, and I'm gonna take the words expressed by Irene, we need to unlock transformational adaptation. And the way to do that is to involve the private sector and to show that adaptation action could have benefits. If we do not generate adaptation action, we will increase our losses and damages, and there is no money in any country in the private sector that could deal with the losses and damages that we are facing, not now, since yesterday, since many years ago. So I think those are the main parts that we have, and I'm still being positive, but the issue is political will. Thank you.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more. And I think also the reason why I'm also optimistic is because actually the example of Colombia and other countries like it, who continuously show up and demonstrate ambition, even though they're constantly disappointed by, by the provision of public finance from developed countries, and the overall lack of reward and recognition on these efforts. So I couldn't agree more. Political will. I mean, the climate crisis is obviously a very complex crisis, but it's at its heart a political leadership crisis, right? I agree that this COP really is a test on multilateralism. We are 10 years from the Paris Agreement. Last time we were in Brazil, it was with the convention, and this is a time for maybe new political leadership to show up and say, we're going to get this done, and this was all worth the effort. So moving to that more political thinking, we're going to finish off with Pilar because we're out of time, as this very scary sign here is telling me, and I don't want to keep 100 people or 200 people away from their lunch. So Pilar, to close us off, you know, the GGA negotiations have been highly technical until now, but as we've seen, we are moving more to the political realm with discussions of finance, discussions of structural inequalities, and we will need that political will and that political momentum for the GGA to truly be meaningful and to truly be implemented. How can that be accomplished? How can we build that political momentum?
Thank you for making it very easy for me in order to have the last intervention. Thank you, Anna. And thank you, everybody here. Very inspiring presentations. And it's probably me like reflecting the support for many of the issues that were raised by the previous panelists. So the first thing to raise is that I think that this false dichotomy between technical and political issues is just a narrative. So let's break it together. From when adaptation doesn't need, it's not tangible, it's very tangible. What we are suffering, what we are experiencing is quite obvious for our communities, in particular the most vulnerable. Who can say that adaptation is not tangible? At the same time, who can say that adaptation doesn't need technicians or technical knowledge, and that we share that? Don't we need science anymore? So this is a dichotomy that we need to break. We need political thought, political will. We need technical support in order to make adaptation better, more efficient, and with the resources that we have. So we can build together, all the people here and the ones that couldn't be here but are listening probably today or in the next days, these conversations, how we can build together along with presidency of COP30 a new narrative. And the pieces of that narrative were already raised by many people here, not only all of us, but the previous people from Natalie and Marina at the beginning and all the other people. So first thing for Brazil in particular is how we build from our domestic realities, how you build, and we can help you to build all together as an adaptation community, as a global community, that there is a clear relationship with what you are experiencing, the droughts, the floods, all these extreme weather events, and all these things we are all experiencing, and this global scale of adaptation. There is not a gap in between. That is completely not natural. It is built. It is politically built. So let's break it together, that new narrative. The second issue is the need of media. We need more effective communication for that, to talk to people. Because when we talk to people about emissions only, it's very difficult. How you follow that? But when you talk to people about impacts, what you are experiencing today in your home, in the home of your neighbor, that is very tangible. So let's break it also from media perspective. Then, of course, all this narrative about multilateral efforts, let's break the idea that multilateralism doesn't work. International cooperation is not effective enough. So maybe we did things not so well in terms of the process of the process of the process. So let's talk about content. Let's talk about people, ecosystems. That's what we need to talk. Here in the next sessions, in the UNFCCC, let's break it together. We are ambassadors. We are the people with that will from our own roles to break that together. Of course, the Brazilian presidency, but each of us sustaining, supporting this presidency to make the real change. And my last idea is to say, let's avoid that two more lies that we have related to that. That adaptation is not political, that adaptation is for some reason not natural or is outside of ecosystem and people life. So like, I would say in Spanish, la despolitización, la desnaturalización of adaptation. I know in Portuguese you also have those words. Let's avoid those thoughts. We need to understand the politics, the natural, the ecosystem, the people behind adaptation. That is adaptation. All that 30 years of people fighting at that place in the UNFCCC, and decades and a lot of years people fighting in their homes for making adaptation more effective. Thank you.
Thank you again to the panelists. This was amazing, and we're so grateful for your interventions. And again, thanks for the organizers, the translators, and all the staff that made this happen today. And thank you, Pilar, for those words. We're all leaving feeling a little bit better and more empowered, I think.
Gente, obrigada, foi incrível. Vocês são
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing. You were all amazing people. I think I'm going to, order a cap, saying make adaptation a political effort, maybe for the upcoming COP conference. We now have a photo opportunity, but just a few housekeeping announcements for those of you online, those of you on YouTube. You will be getting a new link for the afternoon sessions. Let me remind you that we will start again at 2 o'clock sharp, because we need to wrap up with Andrea Correa do Lago and Marcelo Lins at the scheduled time later in the afternoon. You can also follow the live videos online. There you will be getting a new video link for those of you on YouTube. We will be having brunch, not exactly lunch as I was told, but rather brunch upstairs. You're all invited. So please do be back. Make sure you're back before 2 o'clock so we can
Stop making a fool out of me. Why don't you come on over, Valerie? Valerie. Put your house up for sale. Did you get a good lawyer? Hope you didn't catch a tan. Hope you find the right man who'll fix it for you. Are you shopping anywhere? Change the color of your hair. Are you busy? You have to pay that fine. You're dodging all the time. I used to daisy. Since I've come home, well, my body's been a mess, and I've missed your ginger hair and the way you like to dress. Won't you come on over? Stop making a fool out of me. Why don't you come on over, Valerie? Valerie. Valerie.